Ancient Egypt. For millennium, it has captured the imaginations, hearts, and minds of generations of truth seekers, eager to know who really built the pyramids, when they were built, and why they were built.
This documentary series is comprehensive. It's the biggest documentary series ever made about ancient Egypt. This documentary series will not only rewrite the history of ancient Egypt, it will turn the history of the human race upside down. So come with me as we go down the Nile and we discover the truth beneath the sands of Egypt. Ever since I was a child, I had a fascination with ancient Egypt. Any book, any documentary, I watched it, I read everything. But every time I saw it or I read it, something about what the Egyptologists were telling me didn't ring true. And for years and years and years, like a big jigsaw puzzle, I tried to put the pieces together. And I tried to put them together the way the Egyptologists had them. But the picture didn't make sense. And then I came to Egypt and I saw the evidence for myself. And the picture started to take a different shape. So come with me as we go down the Nile and we discover the truth beneath the sands of Egypt. Most people are aware of the 3 Great Pyramids at Giza. I mean, it's pretty hard to miss them. But the reality is, there are over 100 pyramids currently known to exist in Egypt. Many of them almost unrecognisable piles of rubble or in poor states of disrepair. Were they built as the burial sites of the kings and queens of ancient Egypt, as the Egyptologists tell us? Or do they symbolise something else? Such as the primeval mound out of which the sun god creator was born. Maybe they represent a stairway for the ascension of the pharaoh to the stars, or some strange source of mystical power. And what really lays deep beneath the rubble? Is it the answer, or part of the answer, to the true history of ancient Egypt? And how many more pyramids and ancient temples are yet to be discovered? Not just in Egypt, but around the globe, even beneath our oceans. For the moment, the secrets of ancient Egypt appear to be buried between tons of sand and rocks, waiting to be revealed. Now, right off the bat, I'm going out on a limb here, but I'm stating my position right here and now. For lots of reasons, some of which I have alluded to in previous episodes, but others which I will detail later in the series, I don't think the great age of the pyramids happened in the 4th dynasty at all. At least not the pyramids made of granite and limestone. They may have been repaired then, but not built then. I believe the pyramids are much earlier, and that they date to the time of the Zep Tepi, possibly even earlier. And because of that, they were never built to be tombs. So, if they weren't tombs, what were they? We'll have to wait and see what the actual evidence tells us. But for now, let's start with the traditional established view of the age of the pyramids. And specifically, let's have a look at the 4th dynasty.
The 4th dynasty, its capital now firmly established at Memphis, was a successful period that Egyptologists believe heralded the height of the age of the pyramids, when most of the well-known pyramids, thought to represent the primordial mound, the Benben, which first rose from the waters of chaos at the beginning of creation, were built, including those at Giza.
But what actual evidence is there that they were built in the 4th dynasty? And if they weren't built in the 4th dynasty, when were they built? And by whom and for what purpose?
The age of the pyramid was not just about building large and easily recognizable structures, but it also saw a change in funerary practices and rituals, including a rise of the preparation of bodies and the use of extensive mummification in a much more complex preservation of the deceased, and the burying of elites in large structures. The position of embalmer was created, whose sole job it was to prepare a corpse in private. Firstly, the organs were removed and put into canopic jars that would accompany the body in the tomb, followed by flushing out the inside of the body. Then there were 3 ways to mummify a body. 1. The body would be wrapped in fine linen and then covered in stucco plaster, the features of the body, including the face, remodeled in the plaster. 2. The body would be wrapped in linen, which was sometimes treated with natron, a mixture of multiple sodium carbonates, and the linens would be treated with resin so that the features of the body could be modeled. And 3. Removing all flesh and wrapping the bones in linens.
All of that supposedly derived from the discovery of the mummified bodies of Prince Ranefer, son of Sneferu from the 4th dynasty, and the pharaoh Djedefre Essisi from the 5th dynasty. The only royal mummies discovered from that period.
The modern Egyptological opinion is that, contrary to the popular belief that the pyramids of Giza were built by slave labor, specifically Hebrew slave labor, the pyramids were actually constructed by Egyptians, many of whom were highly skilled workers who were paid for their time.
But the real question is, did they actually build the pyramids? Or did they try to repair them after massive damage from some natural catastrophe?
Although slave laborers from Nubia, Libya, even Canaan and Syria were most likely used in the quarries cutting rock, or in the gold mines, they would not have been entrusted to create the king's eternal home. No slave quarters have been discovered at Giza, and there are no Egyptian records of such.
Don't you think it's rather strange that for a project as massive as building a pyramid, there are no records found for it? I do.
Workmen's quarters, supervisors' houses, overseers' homes have all been found and make clear that the work done at the Giza Plateau in the Old Kingdom was performed by Egyptians working for compensation.
And that may be so. But were they building the pyramids, or were they repairing them?
The 4th dynasty is where we see a shift in religious practices, where worship of the sun was commonplace and the cult of Ra grew. During the era, the relationship of the king to the deities became unchallenged, and kings began carving their names into statues and monuments that previously had been reserved for deities.
Exactly as I suggested Ramesses II did at Abu Simbel and all over Egypt, and every Nubian temple in episode 2.
Our understanding of the Old Kingdom comes mainly from these structures and objects discovered in the desert cemeteries of Giza.
And if that's the case, we could be totally wrong about the entire history of not only the Old Kingdom, but ancient Egypt as a whole. So we'd best take a closer look at the actual evidence, this time with open eyes and an open mind.
The first king of the 4th dynasty was Sneferu, who may well have been Huni's successor, but it is uncertain whether Huni was actually Sneferu's father, although his mother may have been a woman named Meresank, who was either a lesser wife or concubine of King Huni. Sneferu was married to Queen Hetepheres I, who was more than likely a daughter of Huni. Her title Satnecher, daughter of a god, a possible indication of her official status as Huni's daughter, even though her mother is unknown. Hetepheres was thus Sneferu's sister, or at least his half-sister, and by marrying Sneferu, she secured the bloodline of the royal dynasty.
There it is again, this reference to the bloodline being secured through the women. Was Meresank the bloodline of the gods and not necessarily Huni? Therefore Sneferu had to marry his own sister to legitimize his claim to the throne. More on that in a later episode.
Sneferu and Djedefre had numerous children, including the next in line to the throne, Khufu, as well as two daughters, Mereithetes I and Hanutsan, who both married their brother when he ascended the throne.
Perhaps not only to secure the throne, but more so to prevent anyone else from marrying them and usurping the throne.
The most well-known monuments from Sneferu's reign are the three pyramids he is considered to have built, two in Darshur, the Bent Pyramid and the Red Pyramid, and one in Meidum, the Meidum Pyramid. Meidum is an archaeological site around 100 kilometers south of modern-day Cairo that contains a large pyramid and several mud brick mastabas.
We'll take a much closer look at the structures of Meidum in a later episode. For now, let's just have a really good look at the external evidence.
More commonly called the collapsed pyramid because of its state of ruin, the Meidum Pyramid is thought to be just the second pyramid built, after that of Nekhjareket.
Well, that's just it. We don't really know when these structures were built, or in what order they were built. Suffice to say, this one looks very different.
Despite the fact Huni's name has never been found in or around the pyramid, it has been suggested that the tower-shaped structure was begun as a step pyramid by Huni, the last king of the Third Dynasty, primarily because he is not associated with any other large pyramid or mastabas, and that it was later completed by Sneferu. What is certain is that Sneferu, at one point during his reign, and some suggest a high date such as the 28th or 29th year of his reign, ordered the transformation of this original step pyramid into a true pyramid.
Is it certain? It means the existing structure could well have been there for centuries before him. Who knows? The smooth outside surface would certainly suggest that. So why order the transformation? Or was it a renovation? Was it damaged in some way? Or was it dangerous as it was?
The inner layers are founded on solid bedrock, but the extension was built on sand, and, as the original outer surface was polished and the platforms of the original steps were not horizontal, the stability of the newly added outer casing was severely compromised, and these design faults are likely to have caused the collapse of the Meidum Pyramid.
Something major must have happened to cause the added outer casing to collapse. Could it have been an earthquake or a series of earthquakes? Possibly, if it weren't for the fact that the earthquakes supposedly totally fractured the outer casing, causing it to collapse to the ground, but left the inner structure almost completely intact. Earthquakes? No, I don't think so. At least not alone. I think it was a massive tsunami. A huge torrent of surging water undermining the sand foundation of the extension, as well as blasting apart the new casing stones. But when? And then there's the issue of the smooth-coated inner structure. When was that built? And why was it encased? We'll leave that exploration until later in the series.
Some Egyptologists believe the pyramid collapse occurred sometime during the New Kingdom.
And they may be correct. But what if there were no outer casing stones to begin with? The piles of rubble around the base are actually made of the sort of small stones such as rounded river stones, not chunks of a major collapse. And that points to a tsunami. But was there any major event in or around the beginning of the New Kingdom that could have caused it? That's the big question. And when? The evidence at Elephantine Island from the previous episode supports the case there was, and we'll answer that in much greater detail later in the series. For now, let's just examine the evidence.
This is one of the stelas to the east of the pyramid at Meidum. What's extraordinary about this sandstone pillar is how close it is to the pyramid and how they built a chapel in front of it. But the fascia of the pyramid is uneven. It's rough cut. Whereas further up, it's been built with very smooth faces. It shows clearly that there are different stages of construction here and different materials, which means big time frames in between. Was this built by Sneferu? I don't think so, and I think there's more evidence around here that indicates it was built much earlier.
Today there is little to suggest that this ruined monument indeed was once a pyramid, as all that remains now is a 3-step tower, 65 meters high, rising up from a hill of debris.
And that's my point exactly. A solid, finished tower surrounded by tons of rounded river stones and debris.
Just to the northeast of the Meidum pyramid is Mastaba 17, proposed as Huni's burial but more likely that of either a crown prince, an heir to the throne, or an unknown noble.
But sometimes accessing the sites is not as easy as it looks.
The burial chamber of which, plundered in antiquity, every decoration destroyed and or stolen, contains the first example of a large, roughly hewn red granite sarcophagus known in antiquity containing the remains of a violently tattered mummy.
Interesting, but was it a sarcophagus? And is the mummy that was inside contemporary?
Either a crown prince who died an heir to the throne of King Sneferu, or possibly Huni himself.
An official, or someone from a totally different era altogether. We just don't know. Maybe the roughly hewn red granite coffer had some other function. Or is it a much later addition?
About half a kilometre further north is Mastaba 16, the Mastaba of Nefermat, prophet of the goddesses Bastet and Shesmetit, priest of Min and the son of Sneferu, and his wife Eti. Most of the mastaba is made of unfired mud brick, with large limestone blocks used to line the entrance. Within the unmarked and undecorated granite chamber is a stone sarcophagus.
Okay, that doesn't sound congruent. An undecorated granite chamber.
Firstly, this is where a famous painting known as the Geese of Meidum was discovered.
So why are there no images on the walls of the chamber?
Secondly, the chamber is made of granite, and yet the building is mud brick, with large blocks of limestone just for the entrance.
What if the original structure was a limestone enclosed granite chamber and stone box, which was damaged by a tsunami, then usurped and repaired with mud brick much later? What if the mastabas M16 and M17 were connected to the functionality of the pyramid? Perhaps they were even occupied as dwellings and buried by the tsunami. Now note that no houses, palaces or administrative buildings have been discovered here. And just because something was found under the ground, buried beneath the earth, doesn't mean it's necessarily a tomb.
These structures appear to be located on what was the shore in ancient times,
meaning the level of the Nile was much higher than it is today. We'll take a closer look at all of that later in the series.
Many Egyptologists believe that the collapse of the Meidum pyramid is what caused Sneferu to change the design of his second pyramid, the bent pyramid, the one he was having built at Djedefre.
Well, let's check it out.
The bent pyramid, supposedly the second pyramid built by Sneferu, is located approximately 40 kilometers south of Cairo in the royal necropolis of Djedefre and derives its modern name from its unusual bent angle halfway up, where the initial 54-degree angle changes to 43 degrees. It is one of the most unusual pyramids in Egypt, as well as one of the best preserved, with much of its original polished limestone outer casing largely still intact. It has been suggested that the pyramid represents a transitional form between stepped pyramids and smooth-sided pyramids, and that there are two main theories regarding the change in angle of the slope of the pyramid. The first that the angle was reduced because his half-built pyramid at Meidum was already beginning to collapse, forcing the builders of the Darsha structure to adopt a shallower angle to avert the structure's collapse. The second, that the building works were taking too long, and Sneferu decided to reduce the angle to reduce the quantity of masonry required to finish the pyramid.
Firstly, there is no proof Sneferu built the Meidum pyramid, nor when it was built, although, as we have seen, there is some evidence that Sneferu may have carried out some building work on the structure during his reign. But does that correlate with the building of the bent pyramid? That's another question. Secondly, as we've seen, it is more than likely the Meidum collapse didn't happen until sometime around the New Kingdom, around 1,000 years later. Does that mean the bent pyramid dates to the New Kingdom? No, of course not. So why bother finishing it? Why not just level it off as a mastaba, or use the blocks to build the supposed new pyramid? It would have saved quarrying and transporting millions of blocks. And I think we can discount the second, because according to the Egyptologists, he went on to build the Red Pyramid, which we shall examine next.
Evidence suggests the bent pyramid was actually started as a smaller pyramid, using the traditional method of laying the courses of the core with the stones sloping inward at an angle of about 60 degrees.
Just like the interior structure of the pyramid at Meidum. What if the underlying structure here is similar to the exposed core at Meidum? What would that mean? What if it wasn't started as a smaller pyramid because it was a smaller pyramid? Or perhaps something else? What if what happened was that the original smaller pyramid was built maybe 10,000 years ago or more, and had been structurally compromised because of some catastrophe, possibly the earthquakes caused by a pole shift. Then, at some time later, a first repair job was done, not Sneferu's, but one even earlier, in which the supporting girdle was added, along with the modified top section. Then they were damaged again, and Sneferu attempted to repair them. It's all plausible. But what other evidence is there that there was some great catastrophe?
I'm standing on the southern side of the bent pyramid, between it and its satellite pyramid. And what's really interesting about this is this layer of sediment. This has not just been blown here by the wind. It's not part of an excavation. This is actually quite densely packed material. And it's rubble. It's the sort of thing that you would get from a large amount of water carrying along debris and backing it up against the pyramid. To me, this is very strong evidence that there's been some sort of tsunami that has swept along through Egypt and buried parts of these pyramids.
The pyramid has also, apart from one section behind the mortuary temple where the casing stones are virtually intact, become pockmarked from top to bottom because of thousands and thousands of small areas of erosion in the limestone casing stones, some of the damaged areas quite minuscule, only a few centimeters across, and only required minor repairs, but others needed the whole face of the stone stripped back.
And when was this repair work done? And what was it that caused the erosion damage in the first place? The Egyptologists would mostly presume it was wind and sand erosion. But what if it wasn't? Why is it that the wind and sand didn't affect the area behind the mortuary temple? Maybe we need to take a look at the mortuary temple.
The small mortuary temple was built of mud brick and contains the remnants of a small shrine, consisting of a limestone offering table flanked by two round-topped monolithic stelae on which Sneferu's names and titles were inscribed.
Again, it doesn't add up. A limestone table and stela, and yet the walls are made of mud brick. So again, is the mud brick repair work?
The Mortuary temple is very similar to, but smaller than, the one at Meidum, even to them both being located on the eastern side.
The eastern side, just like at Meidum, the leeward side or the sheltered side, if the pyramid was hit by a massive tsunami from the west or northwest. A tsunami carrying with it not only lots of river stones, which would have caused the smaller, minuscule pockmarks, but also larger chunks of debris, such as bits of broken granite statues, smashed enclosure walls, and fragments of surrounding temples, all tumbling around and crashing into the pyramid and accounting for why other parts of the outer casing needed the whole face of the stone stripped back. The debris would also have bashed out pieces of the outer casing stones as they bashed into the corners and edges of the pyramid, including at the top, which means the tsunami was at least 105 meters high, probably a lot more. We've seen this sort of consistent damage previously when we looked at the Nubian monuments in episodes 2 and 3, and at Elephantine Island in episode 8. Surely this consistent evidence cannot be ignored. The signs of the repair work are confusing because they surely didn't happen after the tsunami that left the pyramid in its present condition. They must have predated it, which means the repairs most likely didn't happen in the New Kingdom. If they had, then there probably would have been some documentation of it, because the New Kingdom was very well documented. There are records documenting the repairs made to the Sphinx by Thutmose IV, and the repairs to the surface of the pyramid would have been much bigger than that, and yet there is no mention of it. So it's most likely the repair work was done during the reign of Sneferu, including the adding of the Mortuary temple, and Sneferu recorded his great achievement by carving his cartouche in the lower casing blocks of the pyramid, and within the Mortuary temple he added.
One of the things that doesn't make sense to me here on the eastern side of the bent pyramid is here we have all of this mud brick activity, including stones and pebbles that are in the mud brick, and it's right alongside this massive block of sandstone. Now this block is probably 5, 6, 7 times as big as the blocks in the pyramid behind us. There is something that doesn't add up about blocks this size and mud brick.
And that is consistent with the evidence found on Elephantine Island of a catastrophe sometime between the early dynasties and the 6th dynasty, which means the tsunami, the second tsunami, must have hit later. And all evidence points to sometime in or around the beginning of the New Kingdom. And if that's what happened here, then it's what happened at Meidum as well. Which means that we're going to have a really good look at the bent pyramid later in the series when we get to Dashur. Perhaps even find some answers to the angle shift in the very geometric dimensions of the pyramid. Maybe it was deliberate. But for now, let's dig a little deeper.
55 meters south of the bent pyramid is an 18-meter-high satellite pyramid, the outer casing in very good condition and largely intact, but with a number of patches in the masonry where large flakes of stone were dislodged during cutting and repairs have been effected.
So again, we have a damaged structure that shows signs of being repaired prior to the damage that has left it in its current state, which means there's evidence of at least 2 major catastrophes.
But is a satellite pyramid contemporary with the bent pyramid, and, if so, with what stage of the building of the bent pyramid?
There is much more to explore surrounding the bent pyramid. The Valley Temple, the Pyramid Temples, the causeway, the enclosure wall, but we're going to leave all of that until we actually get there later in the series. For now, let's look at Sneferu's 3rd pyramid, the Red Pyramid.
The 3rd largest pyramid in Egypt, The Red Pyramid supposedly gets its modern name from the color of the special kind of rosette limestone used in constructing the pyramids in a burial chamber.
But that makes no sense at all, because most of the pyramids had red granite inner chambers. For me, it's because the original fine tuner limestone casing stones, apart from a few areas along the base of the pyramid, are completely gone.
Which is consistent with the effects of a tsunami, or tsunamis, impacting from the north and removing all of the north face, but leaving lower parts of the sides and back.
Leaving the high ironstone content of the rough-hewn sandstone core blocks that adorn the surface now, to form a tough oxidized ruddy layer on the surface of the pyramid.
What's of particular interest is that all of the faces are not flat. They're actually concave.
Usually when surfaces are curved, like a parabola, it's to focus the energy or vibration to a particular focal point.
But concave? That would work the other way within the internal structure, dissipating the energy. What energy?
Dates found in builders' marks on some of the blocks indicate it took 10 years and 7 months to build.
But what if the marks only represent when the rock was quarried? They could have been lying around for years. And what if those blocks weren't used to build the pyramid at all, but rather to repair it thousands of years after it was first built? Who knows? Maybe it took 10 years to repair.
To the north side, at the entrance hacked out of the face, is a layer of rubble, including rounded river stones, measuring about 15 meters deep, built up in front of the pyramid, clearly indicating the actual base of the pyramid is way below the surface.
Again, this is consistent with a tsunami from the north.
Looking around, as with the other pyramids, though it is almost impossible to define, are the remains of what would once have been a rectangular perimeter wall that enclosed the whole complex. To the east, there were also faint indications of a sloped causeway that would have led down to a valley temple.
What happened to them? See, I don't buy the stone thief scenario. The only logical conclusion is that they were all washed away by a massive surge of water.
The Mortuary temple, to the east, is built on the current ground level, 15 to 20 feet above where it should have once been, at the base of the pyramid. It appears to be totally in ruins, a dog's breakfast, the plan perhaps reconstructed from the floor plans of other temples, the scant remains including a fragment of a pink granite false door stellar, fragments of a said festival relief, and the remains of a mud brick storeroom.
There's that incongruence again. Mud brick walls and a pink granite false door.
The mud brick storerooms could have been built as late as the Ptolemaic era.
But was the granite door salvaged from an earlier destroyed temple?
The truth is, the temple could have been added hundreds or even thousands of years after the pyramid was first constructed.
Situated on a modern plinth in the middle of the restoration is a reconstructed pyramidion, or capstone, uncovered nearby, and supposedly belonging to the Red Pyramid.
The problem is, it's got a different angle of slope to the pyramid, which strongly suggests it wasn't intended for this pyramid.
It's possible that when the tsunamis struck the pyramids, the capstones were dislodged and tumbled across the landscape for who knows how far, perhaps up to hundreds of miles.
Maybe if the experts do a comparison between the angles of the pyramidion and the angles of the pyramid, irrespective of their respective locations, they may come to different conclusions. And if that evidence is forthcoming, it may not only give great weight to the tsunami theory, but also to the extent of its impact.
It also confirms that these tsunamis must have been at least 100 meters high, the height of the pyramid, probably more.
Now, I'm going to examine in much greater detail each of these pyramids when we get down the Nile in a later episode. Suffice to say, there is absolutely no evidence that Sneferu had anything to do with the building of any of these monuments.
To enable Sneferu to undertake such massive building projects, he would have had to secure an extensive store of labour and materials. Thus he led military expeditions to the Sinai Peninsula to protect Egypt's interests in the turquoise mines, and to Nubia in the south, and to Libya in the west, bringing back 7,000 prisoners and 200,000 head of cattle from Nubia, and 11,000 prisoners and 13,100 head of cattle from Libya, the prisoners probably used to augment the workforce in quarries.
But 18,000 prisoners are not sufficient manpower to build a pyramid, especially when you consider that most of them would have been allocated to the large-scale quarrying projects to provide Sneferu with the stone he needed for his pyramids.
Through his military expeditions and judicious use of resources, Sneferu established a powerful central government at Memphis that produced the kind of stability necessary for his vast building projects, including mortuary temples and other buildings constructed around his pyramids, with priests taking care of the day-to-day operations once the Red Pyramid was finally completed.
Here again we see the priests gaining more and more control of the country.
According to the Turin Canon, Sneferu ruled from around 2613 to 2589 BC, a reign of 24 years, others suggesting a 30-year reign. However, during the Old Kingdom the years of rule were counted biennially, when cattle counts and tax collections were performed, which would mean that Sneferu may have ruled for 48 years. The compiler of the Turin Canon may not have been aware of this long-gone circumstance when redacting his document, and would consequently have attributed 24 years to Sneferu. Today it is estimated that 48 years of rule would have allowed Sneferu to build 3 pyramids during his lifetime.
That is, if he built them at all.
The remains of King Sneferu have not yet been discovered, and there is no evidence of there ever having been a stone sarcophagus in the subterranean burial chamber of the Meidum pyramid, therefore no clear evidence anyone was ever buried in this pyramid.
Not to be outdone, some Egyptologists suggest Sneferu was buried in one of either the Bent Pyramid or the Red Pyramid.
Similarly, nothing was discovered in the Bent Pyramid, although some Egyptologists are convinced that there are secret chambers waiting to be uncovered within the stone superstructure of the Red Pyramid, which may be the true burial chamber of King Sneferu, and that it still may be possible that his sarcophagus and mummy lie hidden in his mysterious last structure.
Well, who knows? They may eventually find other hidden chambers. But my guess is they will not find the remains of Sneferu, because I don't believe he built the Red Pyramid. But more on that in a later episode.
Upon his death, Sneferu was succeeded by his son, Khufu, whose full name was Khufu, meaning Khnum protect me. Dedicating his name to the earth deity Khnum, Khufu clearly sought to accentuate his divine origin and status by dedicating his official cartouche name to Khnum. In this respect, Khufu may have viewed himself as a divine creator, a role that was already given to Khnum, the god of earth, creation, and growth. Mainstream Egyptologists believe Sneferu was Khufu's father, but only because it was handed down by later historians that the eldest son or a selected descendant would inherit the throne. However, it is unclear whether Khufu was actually the biological son of Sneferu, the latest research indicating that although Khufu was most likely the son of Queen Djedefre I, he may not necessarily have been Sneferu's biological offspring, some even suggesting he was illegitimate and therefore unworthy of the throne.
What is more likely is that yes, Khufu was Sneferu's biological son, but that his mother was a minor wife of Sneferu, and perhaps not of an acknowledged royal lineage. And that's why he was deemed unworthy of the throne. And that's an issue we're going to look at in greater detail in a later episode.
It's possible that Sneferu legitimized Khufu's rank and familial position by his marriage to Khufu's mother, and, by elevating her as the daughter of a living god, Khufu's new rank was secured.
It's not only possible, it makes the issue of an approved royal bloodline even stronger. The bloodline of the finite kings and the gods.
Khufu apparently had 4 wives, including Meidum and Hanutsan, who were probably also his sisters or cousins, and had numerous children. His sons included Keops, who predeceased Khufu, Djedefre, and Khafre, and his daughters included Meidum II, Djedefre II, wife of Keops, who later married Djedefre, and Khameneptine I, wife of Khafre and mother of Menkaure.
More on that when we get to look at the reigns of Djedefre and Khafre later.
Many aspects of Khufu's reign are poorly documented, there being but a few records about Khufu's political activities within and outside Egypt. Within Egypt, Khufu's name appears in inscriptions at El-Kab and Elephantine, and in local quarries at Hatnub and Wadi Hammamat. Khufu is also documented in several building inscriptions and statues. Though part of the Palermo stone mentions the creation of 2 oversized standing statues of Khufu, one made of copper, the other of pure gold, neither of which has ever been found, and all other statues, including several alabaster and travertine fragments of seated statues, have been found in fragments containing the complete or partially preserved cartouches of Khufu or Khentkaus. The only 3-dimensional depiction of Khufu that has survived intact is a 3-inch ivory figurine found in 1903 in a temple ruin at Qom el-Sultan at Abydos. Seated on a throne with a short backrest, the king is shown wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt, a flail in his right hand and his left hand resting together with his lower arm on his left upper leg. At the right side of his knees, the Horus name Medjidju is preserved, and, at the left side, a fragment of the lower part of the cartouche named Khentkaus is visible. Most Egyptologists believe the statuette is contemporary, but some scholars think that it was an artistic reproduction from the 26th dynasty, because the style of throne the figurine is sitting on does not match the artistic styles of any Old Kingdom artifact, Old Kingdom thrones having a backrest that reached up to the neck of the king. Rather, the throne is from a later period, the 26th dynasty.
It just goes to show that even the hardest so-called evidence can't be attested to with 100% certainty. But the 26th dynasty? That's nearly 2,000 years after Khufu reigned. How does that figure?
According to the Egyptologists, the Giza necropolis fell into disuse and outright abuse during the Middle Kingdom, which is when the pyramids and tombs suffered frequent plundering and destruction.
Or was most of the destruction directly attributable to some major event that occurred sometime towards the end of the Second Intermediate Period? Destruction caused by some fluvial catastrophe at the end of the 17th dynasty that washed most of the Middle Kingdom away, leaving only the major structures which had been usurped during the Old Kingdom anyway.
According to the Egyptologists, the plateau then experienced a revival during the New Kingdom, particularly during the 18th dynasty, when religious devotion centered on the Sphinx, which was dug out of the sand by Thutmose IV, and the pyramids again became the flavor of the month.
Why did the Sphinx need to be dug out? Perhaps it was because, like at Elephantine Island, a massive tsunami had buried it in mud, sand and debris. More on that when we get to Giza later in the series and we look at the Sphinx in much greater detail. And if the tsunami that hit the Red Pyramid 30 kilometres to the south was over 100 metres high, and it travelled as far as Elephantine Island, which is what the evidence there suggests, then the tsunami sometime around the end of the 17th dynasty that buried the Sphinx and hit the Giza Plateau must also have come from the north and been even higher than 100 metres. But before we examine the Great Pyramid of Khufu, let's complete our review of Khufu himself.
Khufu is depicted in several relief fragments found scattered in his necropolis and elsewhere, all made of finely polished limestone, some originating from the ruined pyramid temple and the destroyed causeway, where they once covered the walls completely, others found reused in the pyramid necropolis of King Amenemhet I, at Lisht, and at Tanis and Bubastis.
Were they reused? Or were the damaged pieces washed to Lisht by a tsunami?
Like other kings before him, Khufu sent several expeditions to the Sinai Peninsula in an attempt to find and secure turquoise and copper mines. At Wadi Magar, one rock inscription depicts Khufu with the double crown. It reads,
Hormedjedu, Kanum Kuf, Bigaj Nebu, the great god and smiter of the troglodytes, all protection and life are with him.
Khufu also sent several expeditions to Byblos in an attempt to trade copper tools and weapons for precious Lebanese cedar wood, essential for building large and stable funerary boats. Despite the fact Khufu was a widely known king, many buildings of Khufu are lost, the best example historians have being the evidence of a few limestone walls at the site of a construction of a harbour at the ancient eastern port of Wadi al-Jaf on the coast of the Red Sea. The harbour was of strategic and economic importance to Khufu because ships brought precious materials, such as turquoise, copper and ore from the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula. Some of the papyri fragments discovered there, the earliest examples of imprinted papyri were found in Egypt, describing how the central administration sent food and supplies to the sailors and wharf workers, and showing several storage lists naming the delivered goods. Recent excavations at Wadi al-Jaf have unearthed, among other material, a collection of hundreds of papyrus fragments dating to the 27th year of Khufu's reign, 10 of these papyri being very well preserved, one being of special interest, the Diary of Mir, an official involved in the building of the Great Pyramid.
Actually, the papyrus doesn't say anything about building a pyramid. It purely talks about supplying the limestone. And this is a classic example about how the Egyptologists make presumptions and speculations and put them forward as factual, that the supply was to build the pyramid, all because of the belief they hold as to when the Great Pyramid was built. And all of that I shall get to in due course. The fact is that apart from some later documents, which I shall get to presently, basically everything else we know about Khufu comes from the inscriptions in his supposed necropolis at Giza.
And, though he is generally accepted as having commissioned the Great Pyramid of Giza, the greatest construction of the ages, and where he was supposedly buried, there is basically nothing written at the time about the actual construction of the Great Pyramid.
Now, wouldn't you think that somebody who was responsible for building one of the greatest structures of the ancient world would be more famous than Ramses II? That he'd have temples and massive statues everywhere? But it seems the opposite is true. That in itself is unbelievable, powerful evidence that he didn't build the pyramid. And I think there's a reason for that, because he didn't build it.
The vast majority of documents that actually mention Khufu, known to the ancient Greek writers as Keops, were written much later, by the ancient Egyptian and Greek historians Herodotus, Meidum, and Diodorus from around 440 BC to 100 AD. The Greeks depicted him as a tyrant in their writings, a wicked man who offended the deities, oppressed the people, and forced his subjects into slavery to work for him. Most likely, Meidum and Diodorus took their lead from Herodotus, who wrote that Khufu was a tyrant who brought to Egypt every kind of evil for his own glory. Herodotus's impression may have in turn come from the stories which make up the document known as the Westcar Papyrus, a 13th dynasty document discovered around 1824 AD by Henry Westcar. The Papyrus, a collection of 4 stories written about the kings of the 4th dynasty, features 4 stories told by sons of Khufu and includes one where King Khufu calls a magician, Dedi, to court, who claims to be able to reattach a severed head to a body. On one hand, Khufu is depicted as cruel and ruthless when deciding to have a condemned prisoner decapitated to test the alleged magical powers of Dedi. On the other hand, Khufu seems mostly skeptical of the seer's abilities and is depicted as inquisitive, reasonable and generous in that he accepts Dedi's outrage and his subsequent alternative offer for the prisoner, questions the circumstances and contents of Dedi's prophecy, even rewards the magician generously after all. As for the other stories, though told by Khufu's sons or successors, they are about other kings and, overall, the Westcar papyrus gives no indication that Khufu was a tyrant or oppressive in any way. As to the issue of enslaving his own people, Herodotus claims
Khufu forced 100,000 men at a time for 3 months continually to work on his pyramid.
But were they his people? Or were they prisoners? And were they building the pyramid or repairing it?
In fact, through Egyptian texts which praise Khufu's reign, and through the physical evidence which suggests the workers on the Great Pyramid were well cared for, the claims of Herodotus have been discredited. It appears the people performed their duties as part of a community service, as paid laborers, or during the 2 months every year when the Nile's flood made farming impossible, making virtually the entire workforce idle, during which Khufu offered food for work. However, Herodotus and the later Greeks viewed Khufu, his people admired him. During his reign, Egypt grew wealthier through his military campaigns against Nubia and Libya and his very prosperous trade agreements with cities such as Byblos. He also devoted resources to improving the lives of his subjects through agricultural innovations, including building the earliest known dam in the world at Wadi Garawi in the mountains southeast of modern Helwan. In order to maintain maximum efficiency in government and waste as little time as possible, he gave the greatest amount of power to his most trusted family members, who must have been pleased with the arrangement as there is no record of internal strife during his rule.
But was Herodotus even talking about Khufu? Is it possible he was talking about another king altogether? One way back in history?
According to Herodotus, in his literary work, Historiae, Book 2, chapters 124 to 126, an Egyptian priest told him,
The Great Pyramid was built for the pharaoh Keops,
and that
it had taken 400,000 men, working in 3-month shifts of 100,000 men at a time, 20 years.
That may sound in alignment with a common belief that Khufu built the Great Pyramid. However, that's only if you make the assumption Khufu and Keops were the same person. What if they weren't? What if the priest was referring to someone totally different, and Herodotus misunderstood the priest? So what else does Herodotus say?
Herodotus goes on to write,
As long as Ramsenitus was king, as they told me, there was nothing but orderly rule in Egypt, and the land prospered greatly. But after him, Keops became king over them and brought them to every kind of suffering.
Ramsenitos. Does he mean Sneferu? Surely not. Let's read on.
After Proteus, they told me, Ramsenitus received, in succession, the kingdom.
If we follow the thinking of the Egyptologists, that would mean Proteus was Huni. However, to the ancient Greeks, Proteus was a god, the son of the sea god Poseidon. So that doesn't really make sense. So does this take us back to the time of Nama, or to the beginning of the reign of the Thinite kings? Given the geographical location of Giza in Lower Egypt, that seems unlikely. So perhaps it goes back to the reign of the Memphite kings, or even when the gods returned to the earth at the time of the Zet Tepi and the emergence of Proteus from the primordial sea. This would also explain why the god king treated his human subjects with cruelty and ruthlessness.
Herodotus also said,
Keops was buried on an island in an underground chamber, located in the shadow of the Great Pyramid and fed by a canal from the Nile.
Now it would appear Herodotus is referring to the Osiris shaft, which we shall examine later in the series. But was he really saying the Great Pyramid was built by Osiris? That would be consistent with a construction date around the time of the Zep Tepi, possibly even earlier. But is there any evidence of that?
There's a report by a 14th century historian, al-Makrizi, that Khufu, Keops, or Sajak, as he was called by the biblical Amalekites, didn't just build the Great Pyramid, he built all three of the pyramids at Giza, supposedly to protect his treasures and books of wisdom after he'd had repeated nightmares in which the earth turned upside down, the stars fell down, and people were screaming in terror, and after receiving a warning from his prophets about a devastating deluge that was coming, that would destroy Egypt.
The earth turning upside down, the stars falling, a devastating deluge. That sounds more like an imminent pole shift, the Great Flood in the age of Leo. As we've already determined in episode 6, that was around 35,000 BC. And the books of wisdom point to Thoth, so perhaps the information is right. It's just been incorrectly attributed to Khufu. It would seem the evidence points to a much earlier construction than that attributed to Khufu. So who really built the Great Pyramid and why? I don't concur with the self-appointed experts, the mainstream Egyptologists, who believe
the pyramid was built in the Old Kingdom by hundreds of thousands of slaves as a tomb for Khufu, second pharaoh of the 4th dynasty.
the evidence to support that concept is scant at best and easily misinterpreted. What if civilization was struggling to rebuild itself after the disaster? Most people would have been killed and most of the knowledge lost or buried. Then, about 150 years after the tsunami, civilization recovers, working its way back down the Nile from Luxor, rediscovering the Sphinx and the temples around the pyramids. Amenhotep II builds a temple. His son, Thutmose IV, digs out the Sphinx and also uncovers the ruins of the Mortuary temple beside the Great Pyramid. He finds the temple was attributed to Khufu, and the 18th dynasty does exactly what the modern Egyptologists have done and just assumed Khufu built the pyramid. And logically, that belief persisted into the late period, into the 26th dynasty, as is evidenced by the inventory stela, which dates from then and tells the story of how Khufu built the Great Pyramid. And it explains why numerous 26th dynasty figurines and more than 30 scarabs with Khufu's name on them have been discovered. And why, unlike every other pharaoh, Khufu was still being worshipped 2,000 years after his reign. Not only that, Khufu's influence permeated through the late period, through the Ptolemaic dynasty, and into the modern period, with earlier historians such as Diodorus and Herodotus painting Khufu as a heartless heretic and sacrilegious tyrant, whereas modern Egyptologists tend to portray him as inquisitive, reasonable, and generous. The truth is, there's no evidence either way, unless you take into account they were two separate beings separated by possibly tens of thousands of years and several major fluvial catastrophes. So what does the pyramid tell us?
Located in the supposed geographic center of the land mass of the Earth, the Great Pyramid of Khufu is one of the three pyramids that supposedly represents the stars in the belt of the constellation of Orion.
More on that in a future episode when we get to Giza. For now, let's just focus on the pyramid.
Constructed from an estimated 2.3 million limestone blocks weighing from 2 to 15 tons each, It covers more than 6 hectares and originally rose an awe-inspiring 146 meters above the Giza Plateau. According to Herodotus, the Egyptian priests told him
The Great Pyramid was built for the pharaoh Keops.
supposedly Greek for Khufu, and that
It had taken 400,000 men, working in 3-month shifts of 100,000 men at a time, 20 years to build.
building in steps and using lifting devices made of timber that raised the stones from one step to the next.
Now that might be what Herodotus said. It might even be what Herodotus was told. But it doesn't mean that it's true. As I've already postulated, Keops and Khufu may well have been two separate beings separated by tens of thousands of years. And the priests may well have been describing repairs to the pyramid. Even so, if they used 400,000 men, where did they all live? And there would have had to have been a support environment, family, shops, etc. We're talking about over 1 million people at least. So where's the evidence for a city that size? There is none. A smaller village, consistent with a repair crew, yes, but not to build the pyramid. So let's ignore the number of men needed. Let's say it's irrelevant. Let's just look at the stones.
It's estimated that 5.5 million tons of local limestone, 8,000 tons of AS1 granite, and 500,000 tons of mortar were used in the construction of the Great Pyramid, creating a volume of roughly 2.5 million cubic meters. If 2.3 million stones averaging 2.5 ton each were put in place and set with mortar over 20 years, that means 115,000 blocks per year, or 315 blocks a day.
Let's then assume that they only worked during the daylight hours for say 12 hours a day. That means 26 stones were placed every hour, or a 2.5 ton block of stone lifted, placed, positioned and mortared non-stop without accidents or delays because of weather every 2.5 minutes.
A modern experienced professional bricklayer, if the lay is uncomplicated, straight, with no cuts, can lay around 250 to 300 cinder bricks, each weighing around 15 kilograms, in an 8-hour day.
That's around 37 an hour, or one every 90 seconds or so, without any lunch breaks or smoke breaks. Not only that,
Most of the original casing stones were fitted together with such an extremely high level of precision that the mean, average gap between the stones is only 0.5 millimeter.
that's amazing, especially when, according to the Egyptologists, thousands of men were supposedly using ropes to pull them up ramps on sleds or rollers, levering them with wooden fulcrums and put them in place one every 2.5 minutes. Look, it just doesn't add up. And if that's not incredulous enough, the base of the pyramid is level to within 1.5 centimetres over 13 acres. And the only difference in the length of the sides was 4.4 centimetres over 230.38 metres. That's a 0.002% error margin. That's not only ridiculous, it's incredulous. But of course, almost all the casing stones are gone, apparently loosened by a series of earthquakes in the Middle Ages, and many of them harvested and carted away to build mosques and other buildings. And that's possible. But the truth is, there's no actual evidence of that. It's simply speculation. And even if it was true, that's a hell of a lot of massive stones. Surely it makes more sense that it is more than likely the remaining outer casing stones left over after the tsunami that were shaken loose by subsequent earthquakes over the millennia and fell to the ground where they were carted away and used. It does to me. And what about the capstone, supposedly made of solid gold? What happened to that? It would have weighed tons. How did they move it? Did it fall from the earthquakes? I don't think so. I think it befell the same fate as the capstones on the other pyramids. It was swept away by the surging waters and is buried somewhere south of the pyramids, perhaps even kilometres away under metres and metres of mud, sand and debris. And I think that pretty much closes the case on Khufu being the one who supposedly built the Great Pyramid. But it doesn't fully explain when it was built, or who built it, how it was built, and why the pyramid was built. We'll leave that exploration for when we get to the Giza Plateau later in the series. But it certainly wasn't built by Khufu as a tomb.
To the east side of the Great Pyramid are 3 satellite pyramids, often referred to as the Queen's Pyramids.
Well, straight up, that doesn't add up. 3 pyramids, 2 queens, what's the answer? The Egyptologists simply claim there must have been another queen they don't know about. But what if there wasn't? What if there's another answer?
The first, G1A, was originally ascribed to Queen Meidum, but is now considered to be the secondary burial of Queen Djedefre I due to a deep burial shaft discovered to the south of the pyramid, filled with numerous precious objects belonging to her.
They could have been placed there at any time. But 2 satellite pyramids?
Very few remains of the small mortuary temple that originally stood before the east wall of the pyramid and the small mortuary chapel attached to the pyramid still exist.
The truth is, the temple could have been added hundreds or even thousands of years after the pyramid was first constructed. Isn't it possible the temple and its contents were flattened by the tsunami at the end of the 17th dynasty?
About 10 metres south of G1A, on the same north-south axis, is the second satellite pyramid, G1B, now ascribed to Queen Meidum, although there is no substantial evidence to support this apart from an inscription on the false door.
Scant and circumstantial evidence at best. Just because somebody's name appears on something doesn't necessarily mean they built it. That's the problem. None of the pieces seem to fit. Well, that's if you believe the Egyptologists.
The only sign that there was once a mortuary chapel are a few markings on the rock.
Again, what if it was washed away?
The southernmost of the 3 satellite pyramids, G1C, is ascribed to Queen Khentkaus.
But it doesn't mean the pyramid belonged to her.
Similar to the other 2 small pyramids in construction, it has been suggested the accompanying mortuary temple was hastily built by Khafre using mud brick, but had been destroyed by the Middle Kingdom and was later reconstructed during the 18th dynasty and then altered again during the 21st and 26th dynasties as a cult site for the goddess Isis.
That part of it may be true. But what if it was washed away at the end of the 17th dynasty, then rebuilt out of mud brick in the Ptolemaic pyramid, and then washed away by yet another tsunami? Now, I'm going to examine in much greater detail each of these pyramids later in the series.
Khentkaus and Meidum were indeed Khufu's wives, but Queen Djedefre I was possibly his mother.
Which is inconsistent with the Queen's Pyramids theory. So, do the satellite pyramids have another reason for being there? And is that reason because of the alignment of the stars?
The Great Pyramid at Giza mirrors on the ground the star Al-Natak, the easternmost star of Orion's belt in the night sky. Al-Natak is actually part of a triple star system, Al-Natak AA, the primary star, a hot blue supergiant, and its partner, Al-Natak B, known for the longest time. The third star in the trilogy, also a blue supergiant named Al-Natak AB, was discovered in 1998 and is the close binary partner of Al-Natak AA.
But there are 3 satellite pyramids to the Great Pyramid. That would require another star.
A 4th star, Al-Natak C, has not yet been confirmed to be part of the AAABB group and may simply lie along the line of sight.
Which raises the question as to whether the location of all of the pyramids represents the constellations in the night sky. But if it's there, then that raises real questions about who built these pyramids. But let's leave that discussion for much later in the series, when we've accumulated a lot more evidence.
It's still unclear how long Khufu ruled over Egypt, because later historical documents contradict each other and contemporary sources are scarce. The royal canon of Turin gives a reign of 23 years, Herodotus gives 50 years, and Manetho credits him 63 years on the throne. However, recent evidence from Wadi al-Jaf describes the arrival of royal boats with precious ore and turquoise in the year after the 13th cattle count under Hormizd II, meaning Khufu ruled for at least 26 or 27 years, possibly 46 years if the compiler of the Turin canon did not take into account a biennial cattle count. Following Khufu's demise, an extensive mortuary cult persisted through the Old Kingdom, at the end of the 6th dynasty having at least 67 mortuary priests and 6 independent high officials archaeologically attested as serving at the necropolis. 7 of these were royal family members already serving during the late 4th dynasty.
His popularity is probably because of the repair work Khufu did on the Great Pyramid and his support of the people during the annual floods.
The resurgence of the Khufu cult in the 18th dynasty lasted right through to the late period, with huge numbers of scarabs with the name of Khufu sold to the citizens, possibly as some kind of lucky charms.
I've explained why he would be revered, because of the misapprehension that he was responsible for building the Great Pyramid. And in ancient Egypt religion, the scarab was seen as a symbol of both the Egyptian god Khepri and the idea of rebirth or regeneration, and the heavenly cycle of the sun, Ra. So the question remains as to what exactly happened in or around the beginning of the 18th dynasty to instigate the resurgence of a notion of rebirth or generation. More on that in a later episode.
Khufu's eldest son, Khufu, predeceased him, so Khufu was succeeded by his next eldest son, Djedefre, originally Djedefre, who introduced the royal title Sara, meaning son of Ra, and who was the second, after Neferu in the 2nd dynasty, to connect his cartouche name with the sun god Ra, hence Djedefre. As a result, the king would still be seen as a divine representative, but now in a more subordinate position as a child of the god Ra.
Why would Djedefre need to connect himself to the gods? Was there some question about his legitimacy to the throne?
Not much is known of Djedefre, including his inconclusive lineage, but it is widely speculated he was the son of a lesser queen.
Perhaps a queen with a non-recognized, non-legitimate bloodline. So how was it that Djedefre ascended the throne?
Djedefre's half-siblings, elder brother and sister, Khufu and Hetepheres II, had at least 2 sons, Juanhor and Khimsekhem.
So, upon Khufu's death, why is it that neither Juanhor and Khimsekhem assumed the throne, with Hetepheres as co-regent, as would have been expected? We know that Djedefre married his half-sister's widow, his half-sister Hetepheres II, and clearly he must have done this when Khufu died, or else Juanhor would have assumed the throne. That Djedefre was now married to Hetepheres II legitimized his ascent to the throne, and to reinforce it, he added the name Re to his name to become Djedefre.
Djedefre possibly had another queen, Khentkaus, known to us from statue fragments in the Abu Rawash mortuary temple, and his known children are Hornet, Baka, Steker, and Neferhetepes, the mother of Usekaf or Saru Re, and possibly Hetepheres III. While Egyptologists previously assumed that his pyramid, 8 kilometers north of Giza at Abu Rawash, that largely made use of a natural rock promontory, was unfinished, but more recent excavations have established that it was indeed completed.
I believe this is the most important pyramid in Egypt, as it is not only the highest pyramid in Egypt, but it represents the brightest star in the sky, Sirius, or as the ancient Egyptians called it, Sothis. But let us not digress. We're going to explore in much greater detail the pyramid of Abu Rawash in a later episode. For now, let's just focus on the external evidence.
Just over 8 kilometers north of the Great Pyramid, on a headland about 7 meters higher than the Giza Plateau, and the highest point on the local landscape with spectacular panoramic views in all 4 directions, is the Pyramid of Abu Rawash, attributed to Djedefre.
The vast site with its surrounding hills must have been very important, even long before the days of Djedefre. So if the Great Pyramid was built by Khufu as a statement of how great he was, then surely he'd have built it on the highest point around, for all to see, right? So why didn't Khufu build here? In fact, if this was any other city in the world, this would be prime real estate, with panoramic views that include the pyramids of the Giza Plateau and beyond. This would be the Beverly Hills of Cairo. All of which beggars the question, with all the corruption in Egypt, in a city of 20 million people, why hasn't it been swallowed up by development? And why didn't Khufu build here? Even if you buy all the crap the Egyptologists put out about Khufu building the Great Pyramid, it's incongruent to suggest Djedefre built Abu Rawash after that. Quite simply, Khufu couldn't build at Abu Rawash because either there was something already there or it wasn't rediscovered until the reign of Djedefre. It makes total sense that Abu Rawash was the first site, just because of its location. It's so obvious. And that's totally congruent with Abu Rawash representing Sirius, because Sirius is the brightest star in the sky. So logic tells us it wasn't built in the 4th dynasty. So why hasn't it been built on now?
For a long time, the area has been a military area with very restricted access and out of bounds to the general public, with excavations still going on there.
Now, what could be so important that the excavations are under the control of the military? The only thing I can think of is alien technology, which takes us back to Project ISIS in the 1960s. And though it's not proof, it makes a lot of sense and supports the claim Abu Rawash represents the star Sirius.
Opposite the pyramid complex is the site of Heliopolis, the city of sun worship.
If the pyramid does represent Sirius, and it was built before the city of Heliopolis, then is the sun that's being worshipped Sirius? Now that would be a game changer. Have we been visited by a race of beings from Sirius? The Dogon tribe in Africa think so.
The Dogon, or Carder, are one of the oldest and most fascinating ancient cultures to ever develop on Earth. They live along a 200-kilometer stretch of escarpment called the Cliffs of Bandiagara near Timbuktu on the Central Plateau region of Mali, in northwest Africa. To the Dogon, the sky is of extreme importance, and their traditional religion incorporates details about extrasolar astronomical bodies that could not have been discerned from naked eye observation. Their incredible astronomical knowledge and their fascinating mythological accounts and legends go thousands of years into the past, possibly even predating their own history. They believe that the brightest star in the night sky, Sirius, which they call CG Tolo or a star of UCG, has not one, but 2 companion stars, Potolo, the white dwarf Digitaria star, the star of Phonio, and Emyar Tolo, the star of the female sorghum, respectively the first and second companions of Sirius A, with an orbital cycle of 50 years, and that the second companion star has a planet orbiting it, Neantallo, star of women from which comes a race of beings called the Nomo.
Although Sirius is the second nearest star from our own star system, Sirius B is still so far from Earth that it's not even visible with naked eye observations. So how do the Dogon know, with no telescopes at their disposal, the movements and binary characteristics of virtually invisible stars over 8.6 light years away is itself a major question. The problem is, modern astronomers, whilst they admit Sirius is a binary star system comprising Sirius A and the white dwarf Sirius B, have not yet found Sirius C.
However, gravitational studies in 1995 by a pair of astronomers showed the possible presence of a brown dwarf star orbiting around Sirius, what would be Sirius C, with a 6-year orbital period.
Which means if Sirius C is ever confirmed, and proves to be a red dwarf, it will confirm that the Dogon are correct. And if they are correct about that, which looks highly likely, then we need to take a much closer look at the rest of their beliefs.
The Dogon tribe believe all their astronomical knowledge, including their knowledge of Sirius A, B, and C, came from the stars, more specifically from a sky god, Amma, who is said to have created the very first living creatures, known as the Nomo, in the far distant past. According to Ogotem Eli, the Dogon elder and high priest who narrated the cosmogony, cosmology, and symbols of the Dogon people to French anthropologist Marcel Grial during the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, shortly after Amma created the first Nomo, that being transformed, multiplying into 4 pairs of twins, 4 frog gods, and 4 snake goddesses of chaos, all of whom, the 8 ancestors, are key spiritual figures in the Dogon religion.
As we discovered in episode 6, these 8 ancestors also appear in the ancient Egyptian myths, in the tales of the Ennead and the Ogdad of Khnum. And do the 8 statues in the temples at Abu Simbel and Gerf Hussein we encountered in episode 2 actually represent these 8 ancestors, and not Ramses II as everyone has been led to believe. The plot thickens. There are also several closely related frog deity images in Egypt and the Near East that help to explain the function of this goddess. In particular, the ancient Egyptians revered the frog goddess, Heket, as the primordial mother of all existence.
One of these twins is then said to have rebelled against Amma and the universal order created by the god.
Was this Set or Seth?
To restore order and bring peace, Amma sacrificed a Nomo and dismembered its body, scattering it through the universe, and peace was restored.
And that sounds exactly like the myth of Osiris, just on a grander scale.
According to the Dogon, the world of the Nomo had been dying, which was why they ended up on Earth. And when these twins looked down from heaven and saw that the Earth was naked, it is said that these Nomo descended from the sky in a vessel that was accompanied by fire and thunder, and came down to Earth bearing plants, weaving the fibers of the plants around the bare Earth.
Whoa, now that sounds to me like terraforming the planet, which would somewhat throw Darwin's theory of evolution out the window, at least here on Earth. But more on that in a later episode.
Ogotem Eli described the Nomo as ancestral spirits from another star system who were androgynous amphibians, hermaphroditic, fish-like creatures, and the masters of water.
Now that's an image we've seen before. Proteus, the son of Poseidon. But it doesn't stop with the ancient Greeks.
Stories of mysterious ancient fish people can be found among numerous ancient civilizations worldwide, including, in Hindi, the first incarnation of the Hindu god Vishnu, known as Matsya Avatar, the fish incarnation, and, in Egypt, where Egypt's first king, Narmer, was called Catfish Chisel, meaning he was called a fish, and where perch fish were sacred to the goddess Neith, and at Babylon, where a being by the name of Oannes, Later the god Dagon to the Philistines emerged from the Erythraean Sea, his whole body that of a fish, with, under the fish's head, another head, and with feet below, similar to those of a man, subjoined to the fish's tail. According to Berossos, a Babylonian writer and priest of Bel-Marduk who wrote in the Hellenistic era at the beginning of the 3rd century BC, Oannes, Dagon gave them insight into letters and sciences, and taught them to construct cities, to found temples, to compile laws, and explain to them the principles of geometric knowledge.
But we need to go back to the root of the myth, to one of the first recorded civilizations to grace the earth.
The Sumerians, in ancient southern Mesopotamia around the 6th and 5th millennium BC, believed that their primary gods came from the union between the goddess Namu, considered the embodiment of the primordial sea, and her partner, Ngur.
The coincidence between the names Namu and Nomo seems profound, and the birth of the gods mirrors the Egyptian stories of the Ennead and the Ogdad we explored in episode 6.
Namu and Ngur gave birth to Un, the god of the sky, and Ki, who represented the earth, who in turn gave birth to Enlil. In one version of the myth it states that when Enlil proposed the idea of creating humans to Namu, she told him that she could make such beings with the help of Enlil's half-brother, Enki. Humans created, Ki stayed on Earth to rule over the domain, later married her son Enlil, and the two proceeded to create all the plants and animals on the planet.
Again, that sounds like terraforming the planet.
The Nomo had wavy arms without joints and a long fish tail instead of feet, and, to walk on the land, the Nomo stood upright on their tails, moving like serpents. Each had green skin, but, like the chameleon, it sometimes changed colors to have all the colors of the rainbow. They also had green hair, red eyes, and forked tongues, long and sticky, slightly split like those of snakes and other lizards, and it fed on crickets, mealworms, cockroaches, and flies.
Very different to what we would call man, with the limbs more like tentacles. And the changes to their skin, were they some sort of octopus?
According to the Dogon, the Nomo were able to communicate with each other and with other animals and plants on a level unknown to humans, and given the Nomo spent most of their time in water, they probably communicated using sonar in the same way that dolphins do. As the Nomo were, and perceived as being immortal, in that it was understood that when they died they could reincarnate and be able to remember their previous existence, the Nomo intended to reincarnate into life forms on the planet. However, they quickly discovered there wasn't any intelligent life on the planet spiritually advanced enough for them to do so.
Well, going by what is happening in the world today, not much has changed in that respect.
So, according to Ogotem Eli, the Nomo, androgynous, hermaphrodites, and self-generated through parthenogenesis, acted as the mothers of the earth and conceived a plan to create a life form through genetic engineering so as to incorporate their consciousness into the earth beings they created, and then live here on the planet.
But surely they couldn't start with a finished product. There had to be experiments, viable outcomes that survived. Is this where life as we know it originated? The experiments of the Nomo?
The octopus, fish, lizards, and snakes.
Is what we know as the evolutionary tree really the recorded history of the viable stages of experimentation of the Nomo?
That would turn the history of man, indeed the history of the whole planet, on its head. But let's leave that discussion for much later in the series, when we've accumulated a lot more evidence.
But to the Dogon, the Nomo were thus identified with the sacred feminine and considered the mothers of humanity.
And if it's true, it may well have been. And the evidence elsewhere seems to support that.
The cow and sun were symbols of the Nomo, as they were in Egyptian mythology, where the goddess Isis was sometimes known as the cow of heaven, depicted on some ancient artifacts as a woman with horns and a sun between them.
Are the descriptions of Isis in hieroglyphics actually identifying her with the Nomo.
In other instances, Isis was shown as a serpent with a crown or casque on top of her head.
Is this the serpent referred to in the Bible? Again, let's leave that discussion for later in the series.
The experiments appeared to succeed, the Nomo combining their DNA with the Terran animals, bringing order to the universe, until eventually the first humans were born, created, having both a male and a female soul at birth, and with the ability to regenerate themselves and reincarnate, just like the Nomo.
Quite literally, born in the image of God.
In order to understand what happened next, it is crucial to understand the biological differences between the Nomo and humans. The union between the Nomo and Mother Earth resulted in the birth of two types of human Nomo hybrids. One offspring was born normal like the Nomo, meaning it was an androgynous or a twin Nomo. The other offspring, however, was defective in that it was a single-sexed male, known as the jackal or pale fox, born mortal and with no knowledge of its previous existence. But the Nomo must have persisted, as good scientists would have done, not being aware of the hidden defect, using the mortal humans as viable stock for future experiments. According to Ogatem Eli, the Nomo taught language to humans, although the Dogon languages are not closely related to any other languages as we know them. Rather, they have a system of thousands of signs, including their own systems of astronomy and calendrical measurements, methods of calculation, and extensive anatomical and physiological knowledge and systematic pharmacopoeia.
And these images have been found elsewhere around the globe, particularly in Syria, the ruins of ancient Sumer, and as far back as in the 12,000-year-old temple at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. But let's stay focused in Egypt.
There are strong parallels between Dogon and ancient Egyptian mythology, strongly suggesting the Dogon may have originated in Egypt, as Egyptian hieroglyphics, one of the oldest styles of writing, is completely foreign to any other language known to humans and used visual symbols that were sometimes oral. Hieroglyphics are also written both in rows and columns, and the direction of the signs changes, with texts being written from left to right as well as from right to left, indicating that whoever created hieroglyphics had no concept of human phonetics. The left to right and right to left writing style, however, most likely reflecting sonar communication.
It raises the question as to whether there is some sort of sonic connection to the cuneiform language of ancient Sumer, but I shall leave that for somebody else to explore.
Eventually it became evident the experiment had failed because the Nomo had neglected to take into account the problem of combining their androgynous, spiritually developed DNA with the DNA of single-sexed, unevolved, mortal animals, and, because of the birth of the single-sexed male jackal, who was born without a soul, all humans eventually had to be turned into single-sexed beings, male and female. Further, the problem of twin births versus single births, or androgyny versus single-sexed beings, was said to contribute to a disorder at the beginning of time, a rift between the three different versions of the biologically engineered humans, the immortal twin births, the gods or demigods, and the mortal males and mortal females. A rift attributable to the birth of the jackal.
Was this jackal the fall of Adam, referred to in the Bible? Or was it something else? Something of much greater impact?
To the Dogon, the jackal was evil and associated with our lost immortality, and thus symbolized death or mortality in humanity.
Is this what the god Anubis in ancient Egyptology really represents?
The jackal was responsible for a devastation on the Earth that resulted in the Nomo leaving the Earth and heading to the Pleiades star system.
Is the Dogon's jackal Richard Muller's Death Star, Nemesis, that we visited in episode 6, what the ancient Egyptians refer to as the Winged Destroyer, or what the ancient Sumerians called Nibiru? Is this why the Nomo left?
It wasn't until many years later that the 8th Nomo ancestors returned to Earth, this time from the Pleiades, to help those humans who has survived the initial fiery devastation caused by the jackal.
Was this the return of the followers of Horus, sometime around 35,000 BC, that we referred to in episode 6? Had they similarly carried out the same experiments in the Pleiades, but this time corrected the genetic problem? Is there a similar related humanoid race there in the Pleiades? And if there is, are there others in other places in the universe where the Syrians, the Nomo, have visited a galactic community of humanoid cousins?
In the Dogon mythology, the Nomo returned with the DNA of a seventh ancestor that was supposed to provide hope for humanity and correct the mistakes made from the first failed biological experiment. This figure was an androgynous being who was identified with the sacred feminine, referred to as the mistress of speech.
Was this seventh ancestor a Pleiadian? Perhaps this seventh ancestor was Isis. Maybe the word, language, was a key symbol used to describe and differentiate the three different versions of biologically engineered humans from the telepathic communication of the gods. Perhaps we will find some clues, some actual evidence of the connection to Sirius at the Abu Rawash pyramid. And if we do find the truth out about Abu Rawash, maybe, just maybe, we will find the key to the whole history of ancient Egypt.
This is probably the most exciting of all the sites here in Egypt. We're standing at Abu Rawash, which for miles around has these magnificent views. This is supposedly the pyramid of Djedefre, who was the son of Khufu. I don't believe that, and I'll explain why later. But what's significant about this site is it's representative of the star Sirius, the brightest star in our night sky. To the Egyptians it was Sothis, and everything revolved around this particular star, this particular pyramid.
106 meters long on each side, but only about 10 to 12 meters high. For a long time Egyptologists thought, because of the lack of a pyramid and an empty chamber, and because Djedefre died after a relatively short reign of 8 to 11 years, that the pyramid had been left unfinished. However, there is now a substantial consensus among Egyptologists that, because remains were found of a small ceremonial temple on one side, of the kind usually only built when a pyramid was completed, the pyramid was actually finished.
But was it a pyramid? What if there wasn't even a ziggurat? Just a hole dug into the limestone bedrock, then filled back in with limestone blocks and finished off as a mastaba.
According to the experts, it was a pyramid, originally thought to have had an extremely acute slope. Some even believe it might have been planned as a step pyramid.
The pyramid was supposedly an open pit method of construction, and a throwback to earlier times. All because somebody found a block here with Djedefre's cartouche on it. Forget the fact they didn't find any other blocks with any sort of hieroglyphs on them, let alone a cartouche. And because of that one stone, they ignore all the other evidence and ascribe the pyramid to Djedefre.
We've seen with other temples and with some of the other pyramids, the red granite is put around as a fascia. But here it's directly incorporated into the structure of the pyramid. And that asks the question, if you could just use limestone blocks from around here and cut them out, why would you ship massive blocks of red granite all the way from Aswan, which is hundreds of miles upriver, just to be incorporated as a substructure? There must be a functional reason, and that's to do with the properties of red granite.
The latest investigations have shown the casing blocks were not laid horizontally, but leaned slightly towards the middle of the pyramid, creating, instead of a steep 60-degree angle, a more standard 48-degree to 52-degree slope.
But was the leaning in a technique used to stop the stones from spreading. Even if it was, it still doesn't exclude the possibility that Abu Rawash was a step pyramid or a mastaba and added to at some later point.
All around on the ground, in this high pyramid that's been cut out of the limestone, it's actually cut into the ground. You can't see it because it's got no top, it's actually below the ground. All around, hundreds of fragments of red granite that's come all the way from Aswan. Why is it here? And more importantly, what part of the pyramid did it come from?
With the quality of the stone much better than that of the Khufu pyramid, its outer covering once consisting of polished granite thinly coated with an alloy of gold, silver and copper.
There's evidence of granite casing stones, but no real evidence supporting that, and no evidence of a complete covering of granite casing stones. But if it were true, it would support the theory that this pyramid, with its coating of gleaming gold alloy, positioned on a high point overlooking the entrance to the delta and directly opposite the City of the Sun, was the primary structure on the whole plateau, and that it represents the star Sirius, especially since Djedefre was the first pharaoh to formalize his connection with the sun god Ra by adding son of Ra to his royal titles. But was Djedefre worshipping the correct sun? Was it our sun, or was it Sirius? We may never know. Abu Rawash could have sat there buried for maybe tens of thousands of years, until, in the 4th dynasty, Imhotep oversees the repair of all the major important structures, including the Step Pyramid, the Great Pyramid, and Abu Rawash. Or do the repairs date to sometime after the tsunami at the end of the 17th dynasty? Who knows? In either case, it's still hard to believe, even if there was a massive tsunami, that almost all the stones would be gone.
This is a treasure trove, but it's a treasure trove of clues to the real origins of the history of ancient Egypt. So let's go hunting for treasure.
The small size of the blocks on the sides indicates that the layers may well have been a later addition.
Possibly when the pyramid was being repaired by Djedefre, or possibly a more modern reconstruction and restoration.
It is suggested that the pyramid, especially from the Greco-Roman period onwards and for more than 2,000 years, was used as a quarry.
Even though there was a real limestone quarry just 2 kilometres to the east at Gebel Madawara.
At the end of the 19th century, Flinders Petrie mentioned that he'd seen 300 camels a day laden with stones leaving the pyramid site, the perfectly squared blocks probably used to rebuild the nearby Coptic monastery of Der Nahar, north of the Djedefre pyramid in the Wadi Kharan, and some of the buildings in the valley and maybe even in the suburbs of Cairo.
That may give an indication that the stones were removed. But how many days did they remove them? And how big were the stones? There are lots of other factors to consider too, like how much weight could a single camel carry before you broke its back? How many men would it take to lift that weight? And did they break the stones down into smaller sizes first? And were they from the actual pyramid superstructure? Or was he excavating them?
Have a look at this. This is what I've been talking about. This is just a pile of rubble. But not just an ordinary pile of rubble. It's a pile of hundreds of fragments of red granite. And this is not the only one of these piles. They're all around this site. There was so much red granite here. Now it's just rubbish, just tossed aside. But this is the real key. This is the real evidence. Why move all of that red granite all the way from Aswan to here? It had to have a functional purpose. Otherwise they could have just used limestone. And the fact that it's here is massive evidence. Let's keep going.
Like many other complexes, Abu Rawash is surrounded by an outer perimeter wall approximately 2.5 meters thick.
Not much of it remains. Was it too washed away by the tsunami?
According to the Egyptologists, the large open area between the northern perimeter wall and the pyramid should be the location of a mortuary temple, especially since there is a causeway that leads away to the north, but they haven't found anything here as of yet other than the possible foundations of an inner perimeter wall, about 20 feet from the northeast corner of the pyramid base, that heads east, and what may have been a covered corridor that led from the northeast entrance of the inner enclosure to the mouth of the causeway.
Because it may all have been washed away by the 100-metre plus tsunami that struck the Great Pyramid and which no doubt would have swept over Abu Rawash as well.
If there is a valley temple, they haven't found one. But presumably, like most of the other pyramids, there would have been one at the other end of the causeway, and, beyond that, another connection would have led to a quay on the Nile, but it would have to have been at least a mile and a half to have reached the pyramid complex through the wadi from the Nile, arriving at a mortuary temple here before the pyramid.
Unless the water level of the Nile was much higher, which the evidence at Meidum would seem to indicate. So where are they? The Valley Temple, the Quay, the Mortuary Temple, swept away by the same tsunami that hit the Great Pyramid, or buried, or both?
The area to the north between the outer wall and the pyramid is surrounded by random piles of rocks, including several larger rectangular blocks of red granite laying along what would have been the northern face of the pyramid.
And there it is again, red granite. But the closest red granite quarry is over 800 kilometres to the south, in Aswan. And there's no way that's their original position, which beggars the question, where did they originally sit?
Although it's hard to piece them all together and make some sort of sense of it all, from the proliferation of flush sides, the blocks were clearly fragments of some sort of structure. However, there are no hieroglyphs or curved column fragments, not like on Elephantine Island, and they are not ornamental or structural, leaving only functional, supporting the theory they weren't part of a temple or part of the outer casing.
Meaning they must have been part of the core, the inner chambers or workings of the pyramid.
In other places, the red granite is rough-hewn and, in some parts, very worn, aged.
The stones are hardly weather-worn because of the range of the surfaces. So is the damage due to some other cause of deterioration?
At the foot of one block is a strangely shaped piece of red granite with a square base and a rounded top. Further along, on the next level up, another massive long piece of red granite with an angled-shaped end, clearly related to its function, being used as part of the entrance staircase that leads to the inside of the pyramid.
Pieces of granite, ranging from these small fragments that were once part of much larger pieces of block that have been smashed up, ranging to massive pieces, like this one that's lying over here, which have a beveled edge on it. And that beveling was part of a gabled ceiling that sat atop the chamber deep down inside the pyramid.
What's it doing outside the pyramid? Clearly, it was part of the inner chambers, but exhumed in the search for treasure. But why was it left behind and not taken away? The answer is quite simple. Because limestone is easier to carve and shape, and could be cut down and used to build other structures, whereas granite is too hard to be cut by the simple tools of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The larger pieces would have been just too heavy for a camel to carry, and the smaller pieces seem to have resulted from being smashed into irregular, unusable shapes. Certainly not as practical as the limestone blocks, and it explains why the pieces of granite have just been left lying around. As with the other pyramids, I'll leave the exploration of the interior of Abu Rawash until later in the series, when we reach the Giza Plateau. For now, let's just look at the external evidence.
In the northeast corner of the inner enclosure, archaeologists discovered workshops and housing they believe were used by the pyramid's builders. Part of their proof was the discovery of layers of limestone chips left from what was believed to be a stone yard where the pyramid blocks were worked.
But rather than working the blocks for the building of the pyramid, I think it's more than likely the layers of limestone chips are from the existing pyramid stones that were broken down into smaller transportable sizes for removal.
Either way you look at it, it's a lot of stones. And they may well have used the blocks to build new structures, but it may not have been the reason they wanted it all removed. I think their main objective, quite clearly, was to clear the site so they could find treasure. I think they excavated the stones, especially from the main shaft, cut them down into manageable sizes, loaded them on camels, and then carted them away where they were appropriated to build new structures.
Another discovery within the main enclosure, for which there was no obvious explanation, was a second enclosure wall from which an underground corridor ran northeast, leading to the Sacred Way. Heading east, parsing more red granite block fragments, corralled into rows on the plains of the plateau beside the pyramid, one arrives at the site of the ruined Mortuary temple, many of the wall foundations reconstructed out of limestone fragments and / or mud brick, forming a number of compartments and chambers surrounding an open courtyard that still has some of its original pavement. In the middle of the northeastern section is, what would once have been, a row of columns once inscribed with Djedefre's cartouche. It was these columns, and the discovery of fragments of statues of 3 of Djedefre's sons and 2 of his daughters near here, that led to the pyramid being attributed to Djedefre.
Well, they may indicate who built the temple, but it's hardly irrefutable evidence as to who built the pyramid.
Heading south, one parses more random red granite fragments scattered through the temple site until, in front of some recently restored structures that looked like storerooms, you arrive at an excavated trench carefully carved out of the rock in the shape of a boat.
You'd think so, from the shape, that it's a boat pit. But no, they found the fragments of around 120 statues buried here, most of which were representations of Djedefre sitting on his throne, and seemingly intentionally destroyed.
Some Egyptologists have speculated the damage was done by the Hyksos invaders of the 15th and 16th dynasties, others that it was the later Muslims.
That might account for the damage, but not necessarily for the burial. Isn't it possible the temple and its contents were flattened by the tsunami at the end of the 17th dynasty? And, in the cleanup that followed, during the 18th dynasty, they were simply buried because they were broken.
Moving on towards the open plateau before the south face of the pyramid, one discovers chunks of red granite scattered here and there on the ground, including one block of red granite about 5 feet long. Along one of its edges are regularly spaced notches, like the sort of notches you'd see for a toothed wheel, perhaps part of an interlocking system designed to hold the stone in place, but more likely evidence of a hidden sliding door mechanism that, as the wheel turned, would slide the length of granite, perhaps closing or opening some sort of door or portcullis. A short distance away, propped up by a few stones, is another impressive piece of red granite, this one cut into a perfect rectangle about 1 meter wide, 4 feet long, and around 9 inches thick. The surface of the face has been shaped into a shallow but precise concave surface with grooved raised edges along the length, a feat that could only have been accomplished by a level of skill, technology, and accomplishment far in excess of that we possess today.
Look at this amazing piece of stone. It's a piece of red granite. What's really significant about this is not just the shape. This has been deliberately formed this way. But look at this surface. This is not flat. This is actually scooped out. Convex, concave, whichever way you want to look at it. And you can see there are machining marks. This is a curve, perfect arc that goes along here. This could not have been created by bashing it and smoothing it with diorite or something like that. This is a machined piece of stonework, and it's extraordinary.
Is the significance of the piece its geology, its machining, or its very presence here? Perhaps it's all three.
Then there is the mystery of the two small satellite pyramids, one, about 2 kilometers to the northeast, discovered by John Espring in 1837, the other, discovered in 2002 by the Franco-Swiss team, to the southeast of the main pyramid.
Behind me is the satellite pyramid that's associated with the main pyramid here at Abu Rawash.
Although above the ground, the second satellite pyramid was only around 2 meters high, with sides 10 meters long at the base. It included a small underground structure with 3 chambers, the walls of the chambers lined with splendid blue faience tiles like those in the step pyramid of Djedefre at Saqqara and in the south tomb of the same site.
And we already have doubts about the origins and the history of that pyramid.
Also found in the chambers was an alabaster vase 35 centimeter high, fragments of a large alabaster platter, and a measuring implement in basalt.
They could have been placed there at any time. But 2 satellite pyramids? Now, sure, they could be Queen's pyramids for Djedefre II and Khentkaus. That is, if the main pyramid was built by Djedefre.
Now, if we believe the Egyptologists, they say that this was built by the pharaoh in honour of his queen. But we've seen a lot of evidence of 5, 6 satellite pyramids, but not as many queens. And the opposite, where there will be only 1 pyramid but many queens. So that theory of the queen's pyramids doesn't really hold true to form. So we should really look for some other option. And I think the clue is in the skies. I think that this shows that the Sirius system was part of a binary system. And the people who built this knew that, and so they built all of these satellite pyramids for all of the pyramids to show the number of stars associated with those constellations. Now that would need an astronomer to have a look at. That's not my area. I'll leave for someone else to look at that. But if that's true...
As the pyramid is supposed to represent Sirius A, then it makes total sense that the 2 satellite pyramids represent Sirius B and the smaller Sirius C, referred to by the Dogon. Hieroglyphics supposedly found in one of the subterranean chambers of the smaller Sirius C pyramid spelled out the word Keops. Not Djedefre, not Djedefre II and Khentkaus, not even Khufu, but Keops. They wouldn't have been original, but added at a later time. But when? And can this evidence be relied on? I doubt it.
And we know that Sirius actually has Sirius A, B and C. Then somewhere around here is the remnants of another satellite pyramid. And if that's discovered, I think that's pretty conclusive evidence.
Which raises the question as to whether the location of all of the pyramids represents the constellations in the night sky. Much more on that in later episodes.
This is very exciting. This is the pyramid of Abu Rawash. As you can see, all of the limestone blocks that have been put in here around the outside of the pyramid. But what's more exciting, look to the side. Look at this layer of sediment and rock that has been pushed up against the pyramid and buried the lower part of the pyramid. This has been washed in here. Now, there's no way known that this is Nile silt. This has not been washed down the Nile. It's not even the right color as the Nile mud. This is from another direction. This is sand. This is sandy silt. This has come from the Mediterranean. This could only have got here by a tsunami in excess of 200 feet high because of the height of this pyramid. Perhaps even more, 300, 400, 500 feet high. This is major evidence here that the archaeologists and the Egyptologists just seem to have ignored. This can't be ignored. It's powerful evidence.
Finally, a good kilometre to the west side of the plateau, beyond 2 vertical shafts, is a narrow staircase descending deep into the bedrock. The passage descends about 15 metres before a pool of dark muddy water blocks the path, most likely caused by the raised level of the underlying water table. Looking up, Above, a huge block covered the narrow trench, indicating that at one time the whole thing may have been covered with these blocks to make a roof for the staircase.
Where does the staircase lead? Because it's clearly important. What is it that lays beneath the ground here at Abu Rawash that is so important the whole area has been closed to the public and declared a military site? Did it have something to do with its correlation to Sirius? We'll investigate that in a later episode.
Djedefre is also considered by some scholars as the creator of the Sphinx, the largest monolithic statue in the world, depicting a reclining lion's body with the head and face of a king, while others attribute this monument to his brother and successor, Khafre. Still others claim it may actually be Khufu's.
There's actually no evidence as to who carved it out of the bedrock, or when it was done, and personally I don't attribute it to any of them. But we will examine the evidence about the Sphinx when we get to Giza in a later episode.
The Turin King list credits Djedefre with a rule of 8 years, but possibly it was as long as 11 years. Following the relatively short reign of Djedefre, tradition and protocol said the throne should have gone to one of Djedefre's several sons, Hornet, Baka, or Steker, but it didn't. Instead, the next to assume the throne was Khafre, Djedefre's supposed younger brother. Khafre is thought by most Egyptologists to be the son of Queen Mary Tites I, others that he may be a son of her sister Queen Hanutsan.
Both of which were royal daughters of Queen Djedefre, the royal wife of Sneferu. So why didn't one of Djedefre's sons assume the throne? I don't think it was because Khafre was Djedefre's half-brother. Rather, and more importantly, I think it was because Khafre was the full brother of Keops, meaning he had a more legitimate maternal lineage than Djedefre's sons, who were most likely born to a minor wife. It's even thought Khafre married his now twice widowed full sister Djedefre II, I think, to seal the deal and assume the throne.
Khafre had several wives, his sisters, Djedefre II, wife of Keops, and then Djedefre, Queen Merisang III, and Queen Khamenephti I, along with at least 2 others, Hekenu Hejet and possibly Persinet. Queen Merisang III was the daughter of Keops and Djedefre II, and thus also Khafre's niece. She was the mother of Khafre's sons, Neber-Marbet, Duharinre, Nuserer, and Khentkaus I, and a daughter named Shepsetkau. Queen Khamenephti I was the mother of both Menkaure and his principal Queen Khamenephti II.
It was all about securing the throne and securing the bloodline.
As earlier kings had done, Khafre associated himself with the god Horus. However, unlike the kings of the early dynastic period, Khafre, and those who came after him, referred to himself as a son of Horus, associated with the god, but not the living god himself. Altogether, Khafre fathered at least 12 sons and 3 or 4 daughters. However, like Khufu, his father before him, there is not much known about Khafre, except several Egyptian texts that indicate he followed his father's policies and model of government in placing power in the hands of his closest family members and maintaining a tight control over policies and laws.
Nepotism was clearly rife in ancient Egypt.
Just as he had done with his father, Herodotus, writing 2,000 years after Khafre's life, similarly depicted Khafre as a cruel tyrant, writing,
After Keops was dead, his brother Khafre succeeded to the royal throne. This king followed the same manner as the other, and ruled for 56 years. Here they reckon altogether 106 years, during which they say that there was nothing but evil for the Egyptians, and the temples were kept closed and not opened during all that time.
In a country so dominated by religious beliefs, it's highly unlikely that a king would ban any religious practices, especially when his brother before him, Djedefre, had specifically aligned himself with the god Ra. I don't buy it. But if Khufu wasn't Keops, then Khafre wasn't Khephren. And if, instead, the kings were non-human gods living at least 36,000 years ago, and the humans had basically just survived a great flood or a pole shift and were worshipping pagan idols, then it makes perfect sense that the gods would forbid such superstitious practices.
Khafre was the builder of the second largest pyramid of Giza, alongside that of his father, matching it in style and being almost as large.
And yet there is no mention of its construction anywhere. It would have taken just as long, just as much manpower and organisation, and yet there is no documentation or mention of its construction at all. Why? Quite simply, because Khafre didn't build it.
Further, Egyptologists claim Khafre deliberately built the second pyramid on higher ground and in the central position to outdo his father.
That, despite the conveniently overlooked fact that it was another 4 years before Menkaure even assumed the throne, let alone built his pyramid. So there was no central position, and assuming the pyramids were built in succession, it totally negates the whole Orion alignment proposition. Or if it does take into account the star map, it means that Sirius, Abu Rawash, should have been built first, before Khufu, and by Sneferu, not after by Djedefre. Further, that all 3 pyramids should have been planned and built at the same time. Otherwise, Abu Rawash being the first and not finished meant the others wouldn't have even been started. And if Khafre really wanted the higher ground, why didn't he just usurp his elder brother Djedefre's unfinished pyramid at Abu Rawash? If the position was important and the higher ground an issue, why didn't Khufu build his pyramid on the higher ground in the first place? Or at Abu Rawash? Anyway, let's take a look at the evidence.
The Pyramid of Khafre, the second largest pyramid of Egypt, sits on an outcrop of bedrock 10 meters higher than the Great Pyramid, and, due to the slope of the plateau, the northwest corner was cut 10 meters into the rock substrata and the bedrock fashioned into steps, while the opposing, southeast corner was conversely built up, using supermassive blocks of stone, probably quarried from the northwest, most likely to both increase the stability of the pyramid, as well as to conserve the amount of building materials needed for its construction.
Now when we say supermassive, we mean supermassive. Some of these blocks weighed more than 5 tons.
The base established, the core of the pyramid was then built in horizontal courses of locally quarried limestone blocks, those at the bottom very large, up to 2.5 tons each, and often with no mortar between them. But, as the pyramid rose, the stones became smaller. For the first half of its height, the courses are rough and irregular and do not always run exactly horizontally, but a narrow band of regular masonry is clear in the midsection of the pyramid, possibly to bring the structure back into alignment. The bottom course of outer casing stones was made out of blocks of As1 red granite weighing up to 2.5 tons each.
These massive casing blocks are part of the pyramid of Khafre, the central of the 3 pyramids. From this angle, they can determine what the original height of the pyramid was. What's more important is they form part of the structural base of the pyramid.
But the remainder of the pyramid was once cased in blocks of Tora limestone, which became considerably smaller towards the apex, and when it was completed, supposedly around 2570 BC, the pyramid rose to a height of 143.5 meters. Now, only the uppermost or top third of casing stone is still remaining, and the capstone is missing.
Or to put it another way, it's clear that most of the casing blocks, except for the top section, are missing.
See, my logic mind says to me, These are massive blocks of granite. How did they travel 100 metres from the pyramid to here? If they just tumbled down, they might be 10, 15, 20, 25 metres perhaps at the most. But these are 100 metres from the pyramid. So something must have forced them down here. Something of sufficient force to move such massive boulders. And not only that, to carve out the sides of the limestone in the temples. To me, that's evidence of a massive amount of water, which would be consistent with a tsunami.
It would be so easy to suggest that most of the casing stones, along with the capstone, were simply washed away by the tsunami. However,
a large part of the pyramid casing, probably from the south face, was removed between 1356 and 1362 for use in the Mosque of Al-Hassan. Despite that, most of the casing stones were still in place as late as 1646, when John Greaves wrote,
"The surface was smooth and even, free of breaches of inequalities, except on the south,"
and have since been harvested to build structures in Cairo.
but is it possible that some of the casing stones were washed away by the tsunami, along with the capstone, and that the others were shaken loose, making it easier for them to be harvested? Remember, these stones were originally so closely connected, the gap between them was mortarless and was measured in millimetres.
The accompanying mortuary temple to the east is built of megalithic blocks, the largest of which is an estimated 400 tons.
And straight away, that tells me that Khafre didn't build it. 400 tons? How could they move it? How could they even lift it?
What it means is the temple was more than likely contemporary with the pyramid, and that it served as the model for the new mortuary temples built in the Old Kingdom and beyond, especially once it was excavated and claimed by Khafre.
But was its original function as a mortuary temple, or did it have some other functional relationship to the pyramid?
Now largely in ruins, though enough of it survives to understand the plan, it was larger than previous temples.
Or was it larger because it was the first, and the 4th dynasty rulers didn't have the capacity to duplicate it?
It was the first temple to include all 5 standard elements of later mortuary temples: an entrance hall, a columned court, 5 niches for statues of the pharaoh, 5 storage chambers, and an inner sanctuary.
That is, if that's what they were originally designed for. But I have my doubts, because until you determine what the function of the pyramid was, then you can't reliably determine what the function was of the adjoining structures.
Inside the temple were once over 50 life-size statues of Khafre, but these were removed and recycled, possibly by Ramses II.
Possibly. I would bet my house on it. Ramses II probably carved his name all over them, like he did all over Egypt. And what if Khafre had done the same? What if the original granite works were not of Khafre, but from a much earlier time? A time when they had the skill and technical know-how to create such statues, way before dynastic Egypt even began. What if every granite statue in Egypt was a representation of Nomo? Or of the demigods, the followers of Horus, or maybe even the 8 ancestors?
As little as 20 years ago, the explanation put forward by most of the early Egyptologists for the random positioning of the 3 pyramids at Giza was that it had something to do with the sloping terrain. Now, thanks to the ideas put forward by Robert Bauval, who proposed that the Giza pyramids were arranged just like the 3 stars of Orion's belt in the constellation Orion, the home of the god Osiris, was sacred to the Egyptians.
And the work of Wayne Herschel, who goes a major leap forward and aligns all the pyramids along the Nile with stars in the Milky Way along the galactic equator.
Now it's almost entirely accepted as a given that the Giza pyramids were deliberately built to represent Orion's belt.
And the other pyramids represent other stars in the constellations of the Milky Way. Now, if Abu Rawash represents Sirius, then the Great Pyramid represents the star Alnitak, and the pyramid of Khafre represents the star Alnilam, a large blue supergiant star some 2,000 light-years distant in the constellation of Orion.
Along the center line of the pyramid on the south side are some core blocks and the outline of the foundation, the scant remains of a satellite pyramid that contains two descending passages, one of them ending in a dead end with a niche which contained pieces of ritualistic furniture.
But Alnilam appears as a single star to the naked eye. So, unless, like Sirius, there is a white dwarf star that is yet to be discovered, the star map theory breaks down. But don't discount that so fast. Sirius is only 8.6 light years away, and there are indications Sirius C may well exist. Alnilam is 2,000 light years away, so if it has a white dwarf companion, it's going to be at least 450 times harder to find. But if it's there, then that raises real questions about who built these pyramids. The next questions are, and have been for millennium: who built them, when were they built, and why were they built? I think that all of the conventional theories have major flaws and impossibilities that absolutely rule them out. Take the ramp idea, for instance. Firstly, you would need to build a ramp over a mile long and several times bigger in volume than the pyramid itself. Where do you get the materials? Then you would need maybe 100 men to pull each block, weighing say 10 tonne, probably a lot more, but let's say it's only 100 men. As they get closer to the end of the ramp, they run out of room to pull. They can't keep walking in thin air to pull it, and there's not enough surface area on the stone or room behind it for 100 men to get behind it and push it. And how do they get the stones around the corners, let alone to the corners? As for the lever idea, firstly, where do they find wood strong enough to lever up 10-ton blocks? My guess is that the wood would either snap like a toothpick or be too massive to be practical. So, is there any evidence that Khafre is the original owner? No, nothing. Nulla, niente. There is not one single cartouche that has been found in, on, or around this pyramid as evidence that he owned it. The only thing found attributable to Khafre was the famous diorite statue discovered by Mariette in 1856. Of Khafre seated on a lion throne with the protective, outstretched wings of the falcon god Horus sheltering his head from behind, reflecting the belief that the pharaoh was a living embodiment of the god. And that was discovered in the Valley Temple, one of the best preserved temples in ancient Egypt, and the only surviving inscriptions there are around the entrance doors, listing the names and titles of Khafre, the names of the goddess Bastet and Hathor. But they could have been added at any time. So why didn't Khafre claim the temple? My guess is because it hadn't been excavated yet from the previous tsunami, whenever that was.
The exterior of the Valley Temple, which is very similar to the Mortuary Temple, is also built of megalithic limestone blocks, some weighing over 100 tons and considerably weathered. In contrast, the interior is remarkably well preserved. The square pillars of the T-shaped hallway, sheathed in solid red granite, are devoid of any internal decoration.
Massive stones, red granite, no decorations, and a weathered external facade. It doesn't sound like the Old Kingdom. It all sounds like something pre-dynastic to me.
The floor is paved in alabaster with sockets in the floor that would have held 23 statues of Khafre since plundered.
This is interesting because alabaster seems to keep popping up to mark the Middle Kingdom. We don't know at all if the statues were of Khafre. It's just been assumed, though it is possible. But what if the statues were all from pre-dynastic times and someone who wanted to conceal that truth to maintain the standard narrative, removed them all. More on that when we get to Giza later in the series.
Behind the Valley Temple, at the front of the pyramid causeway, is the Great Sphinx, held by the majority of modern Egyptologists to also have been built by Khafre in approximately 2500 BC. Possibly carved out as a guardian of Khafre's pyramid, and as a symbol of royal power, it was considered an image of the king as the god Harmaket, Horus in the horizon. As supporting evidence, Egyptologists cite the proximity of the Sphinx and its alignment to Khafre's pyramid temple complex, and a certain resemblance, despite damage, to the facial structure seen in his statues.
Given the pyramid wasn't built by Khafre, I think it's fair to assume that neither was the Sphinx, and there's absolutely no records that Khafre did build the Sphinx. So when was it built? By whom? And did it have anything to do with the age of Leo and the Zep Tepi? We're going to find out all about that later in the series when we get to Giza. The question is, if Khafre didn't build the pyramid, then who did? I don't think the pyramids were built by the ancient Egyptians at all. Not the early dynastic ones, that is. Everything about the early dynastic Egyptians points towards them being a recovering civilization, a new civilization, not an advanced civilization. To a civilization trying to emulate and repair rather than one that made such a rapid technological advance. I think to find out how the pyramids were built, we need to find out who built them and why they were built. And to do that, I think we need to go back way before the early dynastic period, perhaps all the way back to the Nomo from Sirius C. But let's leave all of that until later in the series when we've examined all the evidence. And to do that, we need to dig deeper, much deeper.
There is no agreement on the date of Khafre's reign. The Turin king list length for his reign is blank, and many though exaggerates his reign as 66 years, although most scholars believe it was between 24 and 26 years. Some say between 2558 to 2532 BC. Following Khafre's death, the succession again seemingly took a diversion, interrupted briefly when Baka, son of Djedefre, took the throne, although the identification of this king is not resolved. The Turin king list has a lacunar, or unfilled gap, between Khafre and Menkaure, where the author had listed a king who reigned between these two pharaohs, but the name of the king and length of the reign are completely lost. The Saqqara tablet also notes a king between Khafre and Menkaure, but here too, the name is lost.
So who are the options? Khafre's sons were Nebemaket, Duanenre, and Nusra to Queen Meresank III, who was the daughter of Kawab and Hetepheres II. And Queen Khamenetepti I was the mother of Menkaure. Baka must have been married to the most important female, the one with the strongest blood lineage, and the most likely candidates were Hetepheres III and Neferhetepes. Given Neferhetepes ruled for a short time in her own right, my guess is that Baka was married to Neferhetepes, and when he died, she either ruled in her own right, or until she died, or until a suitable pharaoh could be chosen.
Although most Egyptologists have attributed the unfinished northern pyramid of Zoriet el-Arian in Abu Sir, 20 kilometers south of the Giza Plateau, to Baka, or Bakharis as he is known under his Hellenized name, respectively calling it the Pyramid of Baka or the Pyramid of Bakharis, the owner of the pyramid is actually not known for certain. The only written evidence concerning the ownership of the pyramid was recorded by Alessandro Barsanti, the first one to examine the pyramid, in 1904. It consists of 67 inscriptions of graffiti, made in black and red ink, found in the descending stairway and the burial chamber.
But, as we know, just because somebody's name appears on something doesn't necessarily mean they built it.
The inscriptions record the names of different work crews who worked building the pyramid, as well as the name of the planned pyramid complex, Serbar-Kar, meaning the Star of Kar. Other names include Nefer-Kar, Nefer, meaning his beautiful car is flawless, Nebka-Rar, meaning Lord of the Car of Rar, some Egyptologists proposing that this is the name of King Nebkar, which would imply that the pyramid was built during the late 3rd dynasty rather than the 4th.
That would date the structure somewhere between the reigns of Sekemket and Kaba in the 3rd dynasty.
Unfortunately, Bar-Santi did not make exact copies of the inscriptions, rather he made slipshod hand drawings instead, so as a consequence there are several alternative readings of the Katush name, which means the pyramid could also date to the reign of Huni at the end of the 3rd dynasty, as Huni's full name may well have been Neferkara, as is indicated in the Abydos kings list.
It could also date to Neferkara in the 2nd dynasty, even Nebra in the early 2nd dynasty. The truth is, we don't know. It could have been built by anyone, and it could have been built at any time. Isn't it also possible that there were numerous attempts throughout the early dynasties to make some sort of repairs to the structure, and the workmen scrawled the name of the king they were working for at the time? Fu was here. Maybe we need to take a closer look at the actual evidence, at the pyramid itself.
Located around 8 kilometers southwest of Gezer, in a military zone in the northern sector of Zoryet El Arian, all that now stands of the pyramid is a square base, 200 meters by 200 meters, maybe 10 to 15 meters high, carved from the natural limestone bedrock on which the core of the pyramid would have been constructed.
Well, if Abu Rawash is anything to go by, the fact it's a military zone speaks volumes. And maybe all that stands now is pretty much all that was there when it was first built.
The exact planned size and slope of the pyramid cannot be evaluated because there is no superstructure and no covering blocks, nor a pyramidion, have ever been found.
Maybe there were no covering blocks. Maybe there was no pyramidion, because maybe, just like at Abu Rawash, there never was a superstructure. That, or it had all been swept away by a tsunami and was now somewhere to the south beneath 10 meters or more of sand, mud and debris, or both.
The unfinished pyramid basically consists of a large, diagonally descending, open trench that leads to a T-shaped vertical shaft containing a burial chamber.
Just like at Abu Rawash.
Aligned north-south, the large, steeply descending corridor, over 30 meters long, 6 to 8 meters wide and down to a depth of 15 meters, is cut out of the limestone bedrock.
That's around 3,600 cubic meters of limestone, which at around 2.16 to 2.56 metric tons per cubic meter is 8,000 to 9,000 tons of rock. This at a time when the supposed builders, the early dynastic Egyptians, only had tools made of copper, bronze and iron. So what happened to all the stone? Those pesky stone thieves, I guess.
The inner trench of the pyramid is currently filled in with sand, but, according to excavation notes and photos from the early 20th century by Jean-Philippe Lauer, corridor walls, being cut from the bare rock of the limestone plateau, are smooth, showing no signs of chisel marks, and the whole descending corridor is open to the sky.
Filled in with sand? Are they serious? What are they trying to cover up?
When Bar-Santi started clearing the corridor in 1904, he found, among the rubble, large limestone and granite blocks, some of considerable dimensions and weighing 3 and 4 ton, probably part of the ceiling of the corridor that had collapsed.
Possibly, but what if they were part of the inner structure? Either way, what caused the ceiling to collapse? And why use large blocks of limestone and granite around 3 to 4 ton each when you could easily carve it out of the limestone bedrock like a tunnel, like all of the other tombs, leaving the ceiling intact and reducing the workload massively? Why go to the immense effort of quarrying, moving and utilising enormous blocks of granite? There has to be a reason why the granite was brought here all the way from Aswan and incorporated into the design of the inner chambers of the pyramid. And that reason must have something to do with the pyramid's functionality, something that the limestone was not strong enough to do. And that is hardly the sort of thing that you would expect from a civilization that has literally just crawled its way out of the Stone Age and that only had rudimentary copper and bronze tools. Certainly not the level of technology capable of cutting granite, when even today we can only cut granite with steel wires or machine saws that are diamond tipped. As for transporting these massive blocks hundreds of miles, and even if they could, why? What was so special about using granite?
Halfway down the corridor, the stairway is interrupted by a horizontal surface of unknown purpose, smooth at the center, but with a staircase to either side. According to excavation notes and photos from the early 20th century by Jean-Philippe Lauer, this leads down to a strange construction made from huge pink granite blocks, each weighing about 30 tons. Descending still lower, there are two more granite blocks of the same or similar size, placed side by side, then another two blocks, about a metre thick, to form some type of pavement of the pit.
We're talking about large granite blocks weighing up to 30 tonne each. And that the Egyptologists would have us believe that whoever made the pyramid, be it in the 3rd or 4th dynasty, with copper chisels and diorite stones, not only cut them perfectly out of the quarries at Aswan over 934 kilometres to the south, but had no problem transporting them down the river, hauled them across the sand on supposed wooden rollers or sledges, pulled by hundreds of slaves, and somehow lowered them down into the shaft. Please.
The underground chamber that follows, oriented west-east and located exactly under what would have been the vertical axis of the pyramid, measures 11.7 by 24 meters and is also open to the sky, although it is uncertain if it originally had a ceiling.
If there was no pyramid, how would you know where the vertical axis was? Maybe the chamber was a standalone structure.
As with the descending corridor, the walls of the chamber are smooth, but the floor is finished and covered with massive pink granite blocks, each 4.5 meters long and 2.5 meters thick and weighing up to 9 tons.
For a floor in a supposed tomb? Why would they need to be 2.5 meters thick? That makes no sense at all. Clearly this wasn't a tomb, and was never built as a tomb. It wasn't even a pyramid. It had to be something else. But what?
At the western end of the chamber is an unusual feature, an oval tub, 3.15 meters long, 2.22 meters wide and around 1 meter deep, cut into one of the pink granite blocks constituting the chamber floor. The tub was discovered sealed, a perfectly fitting granite lid on top, the lid having 4 ears, possibly handles to maneuver it. According to Barsanti, who excavated the site, the inside of the tub was polished like a mirror and the side walls were lined with a black band 10 centimeters deep, small traces of a liquid substance found, but, unfortunately, never examined, and today they are lost.
Sounds like a bathroom. Is that why it was necessary for the tub to be an oval and have a mirror-smooth interior? It was a spa bath? I doubt it. I think there must have been some functional reason. Otherwise it would have been much easier to just have a rectangular box.
According to Barsanti, fragments of a similar oval sarcophagus were found in the ruins of the pyramid of Djedefre, and a damaged dedication tablet of Djedefre, allegedly found by him near the stairway of the pyramid, is used as proof of the pyramid's 4th dynasty date.
That's hardly conclusive evidence. And though there are striking design similarities between this subterranean structure and that of Djedefre, they're not evidence the structures were built in the 4th dynasty. In fact, the use of the massive red granite blocks are evidence to the contrary. Evidence of a much older origin.
The existence of further underground chambers has been suspected, but excavations have not been possible because, since 1964, the pyramid has been off-limits as the structure is now part of a military restricted zone, the surrounding necropolis overbuilt with military bungalows and the shaft misused as a local dump. Thus, the status of the shaft is now uncertain and most likely disastrous.
It seems a common pattern, doesn't it? Discover something extraordinary in the middle of nowhere and then declare it a military zone so no one can go there. And in the meantime, the corrupt elite use the isolation and off-limits status to do their own five-fingered investigations, unnoticed by prying eyes. One can only wonder why the Egyptian authorities not only haven't undertaken further excavation of this site, and instead why they made it a military zone. What is it about this structure that they don't want the people to know about? I'm pretty convinced the core is the clue. The red granite chamber. Its shape, its location relative to ground level. It doesn't really look like a sarcophagus. It looks more like a well. And just imagine how hard it would have been to carve a perfect oval out of the inside of a massive block of granite. Clearly the granite must have come from Aswan. But how did they cut it and transport it 800 kilometres to here? It had to have been advanced technology. Some sort of sonic saw and the ability to levitate objects. We know that modern scientists have been able to levitate objects and spin objects by using specific frequencies that match the atomic resonance of the object. And there's speculation that the military and the Illuminati have underground sonic drills that tunnel through rock like a hot knife through butter at the rate of up to 7 miles a day. But where did they get that technology? Ultimately, from the same source as those who built the pyramids. From an extraterrestrial civilization that predated ancient Egypt by hundreds of thousands of years. Which brings us back to the Nomo and their return to Earth, perhaps as the followers of Horus. Did we get the technology from them? It appears that all the pyramids in Lower Egypt represent the brightest stars within the known constellations in one complete 360-degree ring alongside the Milky Way and around the Earth.
And as such, the unfinished pyramid at Zawiya el-Aryan correlates to the star Aldebaran in the constellation of Taurus, as do the Pleiades.
But it's not exact, as you might expect. In fact, it's a mirror image, meaning that either the map was inverted, turned upside down, or that the constellations would run clockwise rather than anti-clockwise, and neither of those makes sense. What does make sense is this. If you look at the Earth from below the South Pole, it rotates clockwise. But if you look at it from above the North Pole, it rotates anti-clockwise. Meaning that when the pyramids were built in ancient Egypt, Egypt was in the southern hemisphere.
The first layer of the pyramid never even started. The surrounding complex was also left unfinished, and there are no traces of a mortuary temple, a causeway, a valley temple, or any other cultic building.
Maybe because there weren't any. Because mortuary temples, valley temples were all built much, much later by a totally different civilization. And this structure had been buried by the sands of time. One can only wonder how many other similar subterranean structures lay beneath the sand of Egypt. One thing is certain, we need to have a much closer examination of this structure when we get to Zayat el-Aryan later in the series.
Baka's reign lasted for less than a year, after which Menkaure, Khafre's next son, became king. Menkaure was the son of Khafre and the grandson of Khufu. A flint knife found in the mortuary temple of Menkaure mentions a king's mother, Khamene'erpti I, which suggests that she and Khafre were the parents of Menkaure. Menkaure himself is thought to have had at least 2 wives, both of whom were his sisters, Queen Khamene'erpti II, the daughter of Khamene'erpti I and the mother of Khouinre, one of the king's sons, and Queen Rek-Etre, known to also have been a daughter of Khafre, him becoming famous for the beautiful statue triads of himself with his 2 queen sisters.
By marrying his sisters, he secured the throne from challenges from any of his brothers.
Not many children are attested for Menkaure. There is, as mentioned, Khouinre, son of Queen Khamene'erpti II, as well as Shepseskaf, a younger son of the king, who was to become the successor to Menkaure, as well as Sekhemre, and a daughter, Khentkaus I. The royal court included several of Menkaure's half-brothers, Nebermarket, Duhainre, Nikaure, and Ian-Min, who served as vizier during Menkaure's reign. His full brother Sekhemkaure may have been much younger, as he became vizier after the death of Menkaure and during the reign of Shepseskaf.
To secure his claim over the throne from a challenge from one or all of his half-brothers, Nebermarket, Duhainre, and Nusra, it is highly likely Menkaure married both of their full sisters, Shepseskaf and Khentkaus, his half-sisters, to prevent them from doing so and thus making a claim to the throne, which would bring the names into alignment with his children, Shepseskaf and Khentkaus.
According to Herodotus, Mykerinos succeeded Keops and Khafre, and this king was the counterpart of his 2 predecessors. Herodotus, describing Mykerinos as being saddened and disappointed about Keops and Khafre's cruelty, and that Mykerinos brought peace and piety back to Egypt.
But if Keops wasn't Khufu and Khafre wasn't Khafre, then Mykerinos certainly wasn't Menkaure. It's error upon error upon error. And again, there are absolutely no records of Menkaure building a pyramid. Not one.
It was in Giza, like his father and grandfather before him, that Menkaure began building his tomb, the Pyramid of Menkaure, the third and smallest of those at Giza and known as Netjer, Menkaure, which translates into Menkaure is divine, along with the accompanying temple complex.
That's if you believe what the Egyptologists say. I don't. The temples? Perhaps. The pyramid? No way.
The smallest of the 3 Giza pyramids, the Pyramid of Menkaure, 6th pharaoh of 4th dynasty, named Menkaure is divine, has a rock base 108.5 meters in length, carefully prepared, particularly around the northeast corner, that left it 2.5 meters above the base of the adjoining pyramid of his father, Khafre, and occupying a mere quarter of the area consumed by the pyramids of Khafre and Khufu. Menkaure's pyramid and complex is smaller than the other 2 as the resources necessary for the building of the Great Pyramid were no longer available in Menkaure's time.
What? They ran out of stone? They ran out of time? I don't think so. We'll get to why Menkaure's pyramid was smaller in a later episode.
With a slope of 51 degrees 20 minutes, 25 seconds, it once rose to a height of 66.45 meters. However, despite being the smallest of the 3 Giza pyramids, it is also the most unusual as it has a core of local limestone blocks, with the first 16 courses of the exterior casing rising about 15 meters, made of unfinished pink granite from Aswan.
And straight away, The red granite tells me the pyramid was not built by Menkaure.
Further up, the uppermost portions, like several pyramids at Darshur, are made of brick, and the casing was probably made in the normal manner of fine Torah limestone.
Probably made? It's all guesswork. Does that sound like a normal building project? Where's the capstone?
One theory is that Menkaure died before his pyramid could be completed, and the remaining construction was hastily done by his son, Shepseskaf, to finish it in time for the burial.
So, Shepseskaf, grief-stricken, tells the workers, don't worry about the thousands of blocks of limestone and red granite that you've already quarried, or that you're currently quarrying, and quarry a load of other rocks instead, and stick them up before the body of his dad rots in the midday sun. Does something about that sound totally insane or illogical, or what? And how would the people see Shepseskaf, the cheapskate son who penny-pinched on his own father's eternal tomb? I don't think so. I think the pyramid of Menkaure was not built by Menkaure. Instead, it sounds like what you might finish up with if the top of the pyramid had been washed completely away by a tsunami, and then was repaired and rebuilt during some later period using stone and inferior technology.
In the north side of the pyramid is a large gash in the middle of its north face, created at the end of the 12th century when the Muslim Al-Malek al-Aziz Uthman ben Yusuf, Saladin's son, attempted to demolish the pyramid. After 8 months of painstakingly slow demolition work, thankfully he gave up, but not before leaving the telltale gouge in the pyramid.
Why start in the middle of the face? Surely it would have been easier to start down at the base or at one of the edges. No, I don't think they were trying to destroy the pyramid at all. I think they were trying to find the entrance, which may well have been half buried already, and they must have deduced from other pyramids was somewhere in the centre of the north face.
The actual entrance to the inner chambers of the pyramid was originally in the centre of the north wall, about 4 meters above the current ground level.
And why didn't they just break in through the entrance that's there? Because they didn't know it was there. Because it was buried below 30 or 40 odd feet of sand and silt.
Old photos and sketches from the 19th century show the sand levels much higher than they are today. They may have been even higher in the 12th century.
And they probably were.
In 1835, Richard Weiss unearthed the remains of an anthropoid wooden coffin with Menkaure's name on it. In the antechamber, inside, was a partial skeleton of human bones wrapped in a coarse cloth.
Clearly that's why the pyramid was attributed to Menkaure. But it could have been placed there at any time.
It is now thought that the coffin was a replacement made during the much later Sarti period and placed in the pyramid nearly 2 millennia after the pharaoh's original interment, with radiocarbon dating of the bone fragments found dating them to the Coptic period in the 1st centuries AD.
So, should we now say that the pyramid was built by the Copts sometime after the birth of Christ? That's the problem. None of the pieces seem to fit. Well, that's if you believe the Egyptologists.
Menkaure's mortuary temple, on the pyramid's east side, whilst fairly well preserved in places, and appearing to have an almost square ground plan, is still hard to clearly define, as the original temple remained uncompleted, most likely as a result of Menkaure's sudden death.
Or was it complete, partially destroyed, and consequently rebuilt?
The entrance corridor from the east led to an open porticoed courtyard that would have been ornamented by pillars, the inside wall of the courtyard made of crude red mud brick and lined with plastered and whitewashed brickwork decorated with niches that were probably added by his successor Shepseskaf. In order to complete the temple after Menkaure's death, a small shrine built within the courtyard dating to the reign of Shepseskaf.
That part of it may be true, but it is more likely a 19th dynasty repair to the temple damaged by the tsunami at the end of the 17th dynasty. The reality is, it's all speculation.
The west part of the temple, a portico made up of 2 rows of pillars, led to a long offering hole, the foundations and the inner core blocks made of locally quarried limestone, the heaviest of these, at the northwest corner of the temple, the heaviest known at Giza, weighing some 220 tons.
I'm sorry, but as far as I'm concerned, there is no way the ancient Egyptians of the 4th dynasty could move such massive blocks. So, like Khafre's mortuary temple, was it originally built when the pyramid was built, with some functional relationship to the pyramid? Then it was destroyed by a tsunami, who knows how many years before the 4th dynasty, before all the dynasties, and then recommissioned by Menkaure and his son Shepseskaf in the 4th dynasty as a mortuary temple.
The northwest corner contains sections of flooring and walls of red granite, Menkaure's masons cutting back the large limestone core blocks to ensure that the front faces of the granite blocks were flush, the heaviest granite ashlars imported from Aswan weighing more than 30 tons.
30-ton blocks of red granite? I don't think Menkaure was responsible for building this part of the temple. Trying to repair it? Maybe.
The evidence sometimes can really confuse you. I'm in the mortuary temple of the Pyramid of Menkaure, and along the side here there's mud brick, black granite, and this compressed limestone. But it's hard to tell whether the black granite has been placed first and then the limestone on top, or whether the limestone's been carved out and the black granite's been put in here. Certainly the mud brick is a much later addition. But the question that I'm curious about is, if you've already got walls of limestone, why would you build walls of black granite? There are pieces here that don't add up and we need answers to.
A limestone altar and fragments, including a head, chest, lap, knees and shins of a seated statue of Menkaure, rendered in pink granite, were found in the 5 two-story magazines that formed the northwestern part of the mortuary temple.
Fragments of a pink granite statue, which again to me refers to a much earlier era and the sort of damage caused by considerable catastrophes.
Further on, immediately in front of the pyramid's east wall, is a large courtyard with niches in its northern wall and, on its south side, the remains of a row of wooden columns.
Wooden columns? Possibly. But not very advanced when you put that alongside massive blocks of limestone or granite.
Abutting the pyramid are the remains of a small cult chapel with an entrance adorned with deep, double niches to either side, and the remains of a small red granite platform that probably once supported a false door, again of red granite, though there was no trace of it.
So the question remains, did Menkaure build the pyramid, or was it already there when he claimed it as his own?
Many Egyptologists believe the whole mortuary temple was originally meant to be constructed of pink granite, but left incomplete because of the sudden death of Menkaure, and completed by his son, Shepseskaf, using mud brick.
I'm not buying that. I agree the original temple was made of massive blocks of red granite and limestone, but not the extensions Menkaure was making. And to think Menkaure's son would be such a skinflint that he would finish it off in mud brick, that's ludicrous.
An inscription on one of the fragments of a stela found in the mortuary temple says that Shepseskaf made it as his monument for his father, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, whilst other elements found within the temple date beyond the reign of Shepseskaf, including the stelae of Merenre I and Pepi I in the 6th dynasty.
Now I'm not saying that Shepseskaf didn't augment or finish his father's temple, or that the temple wasn't further usurped by Merenre I and or Pepi I. After all, it seemed to be a common practice of the ancient Egyptian pharaohs. But couldn't the Shepseskaf stela just as easily be referring to the stela itself and not to the temple? My theory is that the temple was finished, but smaller and earlier, and not as a temple, and not by Menkaure, but then it was partially destroyed by a tsunami, after which, during the Old Kingdom, it was extended, reconstructed with smaller blocks of limestone by Menkaure, who had claimed the pyramid as his own. Possibly because of Menkaure's death, the extended temple was then completed by his son, Khafre, and then, following the tsunami that marked the end of the 17th dynasty, was possibly repaired in the New Kingdom or even later with mud brick.
Menkaure's son and chosen successor, Khunre, died while the pyramid was being built, which upset the dynastic succession, and Menkaure himself died before the pyramid complex was completed.
That they died is obvious, but there's no evidence of the pyramid actually being built, let alone of when each of them died in relation to its supposed construction. So this is another example of the Egyptologists putting 2 and 2 together and trying to convince you it's 5. And there's one more piece of evidence to check out.
Notable on the Giza Plateau are the 3 much smaller subsidiary pyramids that stand in a row along the south wall of the principal pyramid of Menkaure, all 3 surrounded by a common perimeter wall.
So here we are at the pyramid of Menkaure and the 3 so-called Queen's pyramids. But what's significant about these is that they've got different levels of damage. The one on the left damaged more than the one in the middle. Now to me that's unusual. So what could cause a difference in that? Well, my understanding is if a tsunami was to come through and hit from this side, it would cause more damage to the first one, less damage to the second, and considerably less to the third because the ones in front would protect it in some way. That would explain what we see here. Is that a possibility? The more evidence that supports it, the more it looks that way.
Designated G3A to C, of these, only G3A was a true pyramid, the other 2 having a 4-step core. Archaeologists attribute them to Menkaure's royal consorts and sisters, Khameneperti II and Rek-Etre.
Well, straight up, that doesn't add up. 3 pyramids, 2 queens, what's the answer? The Egyptologists simply claim there must have been another queen they don't know about. But what if there wasn't? What if there's another answer?
Pyramid G3A, the largest of the 3, has an entrance in the middle of the north wall, just above ground level, a descending entrance corridor equipped with a barrier, and a substructure consisting of a burial chamber, dug from the rock under the center of the pyramid's base, which originally held a pink granite sarcophagus, embedded in the floor next to the west wall, now stolen.
We really have little idea as to who was interred, if anyone, in Pyramid G3A. It's not impossible that this pyramid was originally simply a cult pyramid that was later transformed into a tomb, or that it originally had some other function related to the pink granite box.
G3A had its own small, east-west oriented mortuary temple, accessible from its courtyard, probably partially built of limestone, but hastily finished with mud brick.
Or repaired following damage caused by a tsunami.
G3B, besides being smaller and lacking the shape of a true pyramid, was never completed with its casing and differs in other details, including the placement of the descending corridor, which lacks a barrier. The burial chamber, located under the northwest part of the pyramid, contained a pink granite sarcophagus against the west wall in which were found the bones of a young woman.
But it doesn't mean it's why the structure was built. Like G3A, it also had a small mortuary temple, although this one was aligned north-south.
G3C looks like the ruins of a step pyramid or one with a 4-step core, but was never completed as it has no casing stones. Oriented north-south, it has a base of around 30 meters and is made of mud brick, but is in pretty poor condition.
Exactly what you might expect from it bearing the brunt of the tsunami that hit from the northwest and it being repaired.
In G3C, like G3B, the burial chamber was constructed under the northwest part of the pyramid, but it was never finished and no burial was found within this pyramid.
Maybe because it wasn't intended to be a tomb.
There is, however, clear evidence of a small north-south mortuary temple squeezed in front of the eastern side of this pyramid.
No one in their right mind would build a mortuary temple before an unfinished pyramid, especially in such a tight space. So the pyramid must have been completed at some time in the past, right? It's logical. So what happened to it? The evidence above ground shows the damage to the pyramid probably occurred after the mortuary temple had been built, which means if, as was the case elsewhere, the mortuary temple was an Old Kingdom addition, then the damage to the pyramid post-dates the Old Kingdom. Further, the mud brick superstructure was most likely a New Kingdom repair job, thus pointing the finger of blame for the damage directly at a tsunami sometime towards the end of the 17th dynasty.
The owner is not known but presumed to be a consort of Menkaure.
More presumptions, not evidence. 2 queens, 3 pyramids. Maybe there's another explanation. If Abu Rawash represents the star Sirius, the Great Pyramid represents Al-Natak, and Khafre's pyramid represents Al-Nilam, then Menkaure's pyramid represents the star Mintaka. The question is, does Mintaka have 3 companion stars?
Mintarka is a rather complex multi-star system around 1,200 light-years from the Sun in the constellation of Orion. The primary component is itself a triple system, a very hot, class 09.5 type, blue giant star, AA1, that forms a tight eclipsing binary with a 7th magnitude B-class main sequence subgiant star, AA2, with the pair having an orbital period of 5.73 days. Furthermore, AA2 is itself a close spectroscopic binary with a faint 14th magnitude A-type companion, AB, situated between the primary pair that orbits the system once every 346 years.
So we have a main star and 2 companion stars. But is it possible, just like Sirius C, that there is a small brown dwarf or white dwarf still yet to be discovered?
Mintarka is surrounded by a cluster of faint stars, possibly part of the cluster surrounding the nearby star, Sigma Orionis.
Yes, it's possible. And if it's confirmed, it adds a whole new level of complexity to the layouts of pyramids in Egypt and to who must have built them. It's fair to say that at this point in time, Menkaure is not a likely contender.
The length of Menkaure's reign is uncertain. Mani though credits him with 63 years, but this is surely an exaggeration. The Turin canon is damaged right at the spot where it should present the full sum of years, but Egyptologists think that an 18-year rulership was meant to be written, which is generally accepted, but it's possible Menkaure might have ruled for 22 years. Menkaure's eldest son, Prince Khufu, predeceased him, so he was succeeded by Shepseskaf, his next eldest son, born to an unknown minor queen.
The wives and children of Shepseskaf are generally unknown, but if Menkaure was indeed his father, Shepseskaf's mother could have been one of Menkaure's royal wives, Kamerenebti II or Djedefre. But if we use the similarity in names, then it's possible Shepseskau, daughter of Khafre and Meresank III, Menkaure's half-sister, half-cousin, was his mother.
It's possible that Shepseskaf's wife was Khentkaus I, who was possibly also his half-sister or cousin, but this is far from certain. Queen Bunifer has been suggested as a possible wife of Shepseskaf, however she may have been a daughter who served as a priestess in the cult for her father. Finally, Karmahat, the wife of a nobleman named Ptah and daughter of a king, may be a daughter of Shepseskaf or Usekaf. It is also of note that Hetepheres II, daughter of Khufu and wife of Kawar, Djedefre and Khafre, went on and became the longest living royal member of the dynasty, living into the reign of Shepseskaf.
And because of all that, I think she must have had considerable power and influence throughout the second half of the 4th dynasty, particularly through her daughter, Neferhetepes.
The only activities firmly datable to his reign are the completion of the temple complex of the Pyramid of Menkaure and the construction of his own mastaba tomb at South Saqqara, the mastaba el-Faraun, stone bench of the pharaoh.
His own tomb, perhaps, and the temple complex, perhaps. But there's absolutely no evidence the pyramid was built during this period.
Once ascribed to Unas, last pharaoh of the 5th dynasty, the mastaba has since been ascribed to Shepseskaf, last pharaoh of the 4th dynasty, based on a fragmentary stela found at the site that contained part of the last letter of the king's name and the name of the king's tomb. Shepseskaf is purified, which concluded with an explanatory sign in the form of a mastaba, suggesting that Shepseskaf's tomb was of that form, and finally, discovered elsewhere independent of the site, another stela, dated to the Middle Kingdom, that showed that during that period, Shepseskaf's cult was still active on the site.
Scant and circumstantial evidence at best, and it doesn't mean that Shepseskaf even built the mastaba, or even appropriated this site, just that somebody placed a stela there at some time during his brief 4-year reign. And yet modern Egyptologists have just accepted that despite ruling for only 4 years, Shepseskaf was not only responsible for completing the pyramid of his father, Menkaure, the smallest of the 3 large pyramids on the Giza Plateau, but that Shepseskaf also built the mastaba Pharaon at Saqqara.
Oriented north to south, Shepseskaf's mastaba, measuring 99.6 meters long by 74.4 meters across and 18 meters high, is huge. The core of the mastaba is composed of 10 rows of huge limestone blocks, built in 2 steps of enormous blocks of greyish-yellow limestone, that originated in the stone quarries west of Darshur and which are currently subjected to terrible erosion. The mastaba was encased with fine white Tora limestone except for the very bottom course of red granite.
It indicates that the limestone steps were more likely a later addition, probably during the Old Kingdom or the Middle Kingdom.
On some of the casing blocks are inscriptions of Prince Khentkaus I's later restoration of this monument.
And as Khentkaus was a son of Ramses II, pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, that would be consistent with the damage being caused by a tsunami at the end of the 17th dynasty. And I'm sure there's more evidence in the subterranean chambers. Given its proximity and alignment to the pyramids of Pepi II and Kakare Ibi, I believe this mastaba has a lot more importance than Egyptologists consider it to have. And if it aligns with a star, perhaps even a big star, then that confirms it. More on that when we get to Saqqara.
It is not clear why Shepseskaf did not start a pyramid for himself, and several theories have been put forth to explain this choice, including Egypt was less prosperous than during the early 4th dynasty, to undermine the growing influence of the priesthood of Ra, and that he chose to follow the archaic tradition of the 1st, 2nd and early 3rd dynasties.
Or the simple answer, that there were no pyramids built in the 4th dynasty because they were already in existence. That those at Giza had been rebuilt and claimed by his predecessors, and there were none left to claim.
There was a mortuary temple and valley temple connected to it by a causeway, although the remains of the valley temple have never been unearthed. The mortuary temple that stood, as was the norm, in front of the east wall of the mastaba, varied significantly in that instead of facing east it was oriented north-south. Based on the material employed for its construction, the mortuary temple seems to have been constructed in 2 or possibly 3 phases, the earlier parts in stone, a paved courtyard of limestone, with later mud brick additions.
I'm not aware that mortuary temples were usually associated with mastabas. So is this evidence that it was what was beneath the mastaba that was worshipped? If the subterranean chambers are made of red granite, it would strongly support the notion that the pyramids were built in stages, and that the mastabas were one of those stages.
The walls and ceiling of the subterranean chambers are clad in granite, with the antechamber and burial chamber both having gabled roofs of granite.
And there it is again, red granite. More on that when we get to Saqqara.
The causeway that normally connects valley temples with their mortuary temples did not directly connect here. Rather, it led to the southeast corner of the mortuary temple before running along the south wall into the open courtyard that surrounded the mastaba. It was built entirely of white-painted mud brick and seems to have taken the form of a corridor with a vaulted ceiling,
which would place the causeway and the 2 mud brick enclosure walls much later, possibly even in the Ptolemaic period, rebuilt sometime after some fluvial catastrophe.
Mani, though, gives Shepseskaf a reign of 7 years, but includes the existence of an unknown and possibly fictitious ruler, Djedefre, who is ascribed a reign of 9 years. The Turin canon ascribes Shepseskaf a rule of 4 years and his supposed unknown 4th dynasty successor, Djedefre, a reign of 2 years. On the other hand, the Palermo stone describes the first year of Shepseskaf's reign and confirms him as the immediate successor of Menkaure. However, analysis of the space available between the beginning of his reign and that of his successor indicates that Shepseskaf did not reign more than 7 years. This is confirmed through the funerary inscriptions made by the officials who served him, mostly found in Gezer and Saqqara, and the fact that many of these inscriptions only mention Shepseskaf, without further details, hints at the short duration of his reign, somewhere between 6 to 8 years.
So, who was Djedefre, if in fact he did exist? I think it's possible that when Shepseskaf died, his wife Khentkaus ruled in his place, and that perhaps she had a consort named Djedefre, possibly a brother or half-brother or even a son or grandson of Baka and Neferhetepes, both children of Djedefre. But that Djedefre never actually ascended to the throne, and that Khentkaus, who was possibly the only daughter of Menkaure, would have had considerable status and ruled in her own right until her son Uzakaf was old enough already to be the next king.
Not much is known about Khentkaus I, other than, as we found earlier, she was most likely Menkaure's daughter, married first to her brother, or half-brother or cousin, Shepseskaf, and later to Uzakaf. It's also possible she was the lady Rerjedjet mentioned in the Westcar papyrus, as the name Khentkaus never appeared in a cartouche, but either way she must have been of royal blood, for she ruled Egypt in her own right, which would not have been tolerated of a commoner, and may have been the mother of both Saru and Nefer-Irkare Karkai.
Which goes to show how much speculation and guesswork the Egyptologists indulge in.
She may even have taken on kingly titles, even though some of her titles are ambiguous and open to interpretation. The title, Morutnaswit should be read as the mother of 2 kings of Upper and Lower Egypt. However, others have interpreted it as the king of Upper and Lower Egypt and the mother of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt. The pyramid complex of Khentkaus I consists of the so-called pyramid, in truth a mastaba, a chapel, a solar boat, the pyramid city, a water tank and granaries, and a valley temple. Khentkaus' tomb, built along the Menkaure causeway, is a large mastaba tomb with another offset mastaba placed above it. The second mastaba could not be centered over her primary mastaba because of the free, unsupported space in the rooms below.
So again, we have mastabas, not pyramids. But interesting, a second mastaba was added on top. Was the first mastaba hers, or was she claiming something that existed way before her?
Khentkaus' tomb is actually neither a pyramid nor a mastaba. According to the Egyptologists, it was cut out of the natural bedrock into the shape of a cube, the surrounding stone used for the nearby pyramids. This cube was encased in white limestone with a slope of about 74 degrees, the same as the layers of some earlier step pyramids, and topped with a slightly vaulted structure built in masonry.
I have a different theory. I think the subterranean chambers were carved out way before some tsunami hit the plateau. And when the water gushed through, it carved out the wadi alongside the original subterranean chambers. Then, at a much later date, the exterior was carved into its current shape and the stone mastaba constructed on top. Whether this was done during the reign of Khentkaus, or rather dynasties earlier, and Khentkaus usurped the structure, requires more evidence.
Her tomb has a granite entrance located in the south corner of the substructure's east face, and was finished in a characteristic niche style of architecture. However, the niches were later filled in with a smooth casing of limestone.
A granite entrance? Remember, all the mastabas at this time are being made of mud brick or limestone, and suddenly we have granite. I doubt the Egyptians at this time in history had the technology to quarry and relocate granite. And the fact the mastaba was altered with smooth limestone filler, I think clearly indicates this tomb had a previous owner and or function, and it was usurped by Khentkaus.
On the granite doorway leading into her tomb, Khentkaus I is given titles that may be read either as a mother of two kings of Upper and Lower Egypt, as a mother of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt and king of Upper and Lower Egypt, or as one scholar reads it, king of Upper and Lower Egypt and mother of two kings of Upper and Lower Egypt.
By the first translation, she would have been the mother of Userkaf and Sneferu. The second means she was king in her own right and mother of Userkaf. And the third translation, that she was king in her own right and the mother of two kings, Userkaf and Sneferu. In either reading, she was a woman of considerable status and influence.
Her depiction on the entrance gives her the full trappings of kingship, including the false beard of the king.
Well, if you combine the inscriptions with the descriptions, then it's clear that Khentkaus reigned as king at the end of the 4th dynasty between the reigns of Shepseskaf and Userkaf.
The entrance opens to a chapel consisting of a main hall and an inner shrine, the floor covered in Torah limestone. The walls were covered in reliefs, however, like most of the tomb's internal structure, they were very badly damaged in ancient times.
By ancient, did they mean by a tsunami that flooded the area around the end of the 17th dynasty? Or a tsunami sometime between the 4th and the 17th dynasty? Or both? Or were they referring to human intervention? Looking at the rock used and the state of the rock and pillars, it makes me lean towards the possibility of two separate tsunamis, at least.
A 5.6 metre long passage cut in the floor of the inner chapel and lined with red granite leads down below the main structure of the pyramid to the burial chamber, which is large and resembles the burial chamber of Shepseskaf's simple tomb at Saqqara.
But does that mean the two structures are related?
Khentkaus's burial chamber, also lined with granite, possibly housed an alabaster sarcophagus, as many pieces were found in the sand and debris filling the chamber. A small scarab made of brown limestone, and believed to be from the 12th dynasty, was also found in the chamber, leading some to believe that Khentkaus's tomb was reused for other later tombs.
Well, I think that's a given. Even Jack the Blind Miner could figure that one out. But was it even used as a tomb before the 12th dynasty? The use of granite and alabaster suggests that perhaps the original structure had a different function, possibly one related to the pyramid of Menkaure or Khafre.
The small valley temple of Khentkaus, referred to as the washing tent of Queen Khentkaus, was constructed of mud brick and connected to the valley temple of Menkaure.
The mud brick sounds a much later addition, mainly because simple mud brick would most likely have been swept away by a tsunami at the end of the 17th dynasty, so it's more likely the valley temple was a 19th dynasty repair job.
Immediately east of the Khentkaus pyramid, a causeway connecting the valley temple to the pyramid chapel was flanked on both sides by a city constructed sometime towards the end of the 4th dynasty and functioning well into the 6th dynasty. Laid out along several streets and divided into groups of houses containing their own magazines and granaries, the surrounding city was constructed from unbaked mud brick, with the surfaces covered in a yellow plaster. Near the end of the causeway, it turned south, giving the settlement an inverted L shape, the southern extension consisting of some larger, more important houses, possibly for the priests.
Okay, here's a great example of the evidence speaking for itself. Behind me is a section of the Giza Plateau that has recently been excavated. And as you can see, all of the structures here have been built by blocks. Now, logic would tell you that if these were tombs, you would dig into the ground and you wouldn't have a need to create walls made of blocks. The only time you need to make walls made of blocks is when you're building from the ground up, not from the ground down. So what's behind me was built on the ground, not into the ground. That doesn't sound like tombs to me. That sounds like dwellings, offices, a city. I don't think this is an acropolis at all. I think this was the actual city. But that's just the top layer. What was it built on top of? Because the more we dig down here, the more we find. And that's true everywhere in Egypt. Let's keep going. This is a great example of the fact that there is so much yet to discover here under the ground, not just in Egypt, but in Giza. Behind me is a temple to Amun-Ra. Back in 2012, all of this was buried in sand, an indication of how much silt and soil had buried these things. Do we know the actual dynasty that it came from? No, we don't. But in the last couple of years, they've discovered this. The question is there anything else below it? Here is another exciting find. Inside the temple of Amun-Ra that's been excavated, which is all made of limestone, is this base made of alabaster. It's a base for a column. And my theory is that the alabaster belongs to a different time frame. So what's it doing here in amongst all of this limestone? Here's the exciting thing. I've just moved from behind this alabaster column, and look what I found in the ground. This massive block of red granite, which of course is very old. Now the question is, what's it doing here?
That there'd been a settlement during the 4th to 6th dynasties was highly probable, and the settlement would most certainly have lasted well into the 17th dynasty. But a tsunami through that area at the end of the 17th dynasty meant the unbaked mud brick structures would surely have been swept away, and the structures seem to me more likely to be attributable to the 19th dynasty. I guess we'll find out when we visit the Giza Plateau later in the series.
After the reigns of Shepseskaf and Khentkaus, the 4th dynasty came to an end and the 5th dynasty began.
Including the reign of Khentkaus, the 4th dynasty only lasted about 120 years. A century which supposedly marked the apex of the pyramid building era and the construction of 3 of the greatest structures on the planet at the time. But closer examination of the 4th dynasty failed to give us the answers we were expecting. In fact, it raised even more questions. The evidence of external structural damage caused by possibly several massive fluvial catastrophes raises the question as to whether these pyramids actually were built when the Egyptologists suggest they were, as burial places for kings and queens, or whether they symbolize something else, such as a map of the stars in the night sky. Maybe they do represent a stairway for the ascension of the pharaoh to the stars, or some strange sort of mystical power. So why do we have such little information about Khufu, the supposed builder of the greatest monument on the planet? And why are there no records anywhere of the actual building of the Great Pyramid? Sometimes the absence of evidence is just as powerful and far more informative than what you dig up, and what lays awaiting beneath the sand, under the rubble, especially at Abu Rawash and Zayet el-Aryan. Is it the answer, or part of the answer, to the true history of ancient Egypt? A history reflected in the myths and legends of the Dogon tribe in northwest Africa, a history of galactic visitation, terraforming of the planet, and the genetic engineering and creation of the human race. Will the answers to these questions pose even more questions? And if the pyramids are reflections of the stars in the night sky, how many more pyramids and ancient temples, like the secrets of ancient Egypt, are yet to be discovered, buried, like at Elephantine Island, beneath meters and meters of sand, dirt, and debris from massive tsunamis waiting to be revealed? Join me in the next episode when we explore all of that and lots more when we take a look at the 5th dynasty.